The fog lay thick over the cobblestone alleys of Victorian London, a damp veil that seemed to weigh the city in a perpetual state of sorrow. It clung to the gas lamps, diffusing their glow into ghostly halos, and settled upon the shoulders of every passerby like a physical manifestation of grief. In the city, grief was not merely an emotion but a tangible garment, worn with a solemnity that was both public decree and private torment. Inside a narrow, cluttered shop on a side street off Fleet Street, Elias sat hunched over his workbench. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows upon the walls, lined with bolts of black fabric velvet, silk, and heavy wool that bore silent witness to the countless sorrows stitched into their threads. His fingers, nimble despite their grime and calluses, moved deftly with needle and thread, sewing the thick seams of a mourning cloak destined for some wealthy widow or bereaved gentleman. The air smelled faintly of damp cloth and beeswax polish, mingled with the acrid tang of soot from the stove that sputtered in the corner. Elias was a man of modest means, his frame lean from long hours and scant meals, his dark hair perpetually unkempt, curling over a forehead furrowed by worry and quiet rebellion. To the outside world he was merely a tailor one among many eking out a living in the squalid quarters of London's working class. Yet beneath his humble exterior stirred a restless mind, captivated not merely by the craft of clothing but by the meaning those clothes bore. In a city where grief was woven into the very fabric of society, Elias nurtured a dangerous curiosity. What if grief could be undone, the weight lifted, the sorrow made less visible, less suffocating? The custom was ancient and rigid. When a loved one died, the bereaved were required to don specific garments of mourning-heavy black dresses, capes, veils, and gloves that marked their loss for all to see. This outward display was not only a sign of respect but a social mandate, enforced by whispered judgment and the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors and clergy. The garments were often stifling, restricting movement and comfort, yet to remove them prematurely was to invite scandal and ostracism. Elias had seen the toll this took on his clients. The wealthy mourners who frequented his shop were trapped beneath layers of fabric that mirrored the oppressive weight of their grief. He recalled Mrs. Whitlock, a widow of some standing, who had come to him just days after her husband's funeral. Draped in a heavy velvet dress that seemed to swallow her slight form, she had confided in him with a voice barely above a whisper. "It is as though I am buried alive, Elias. The sorrow clings not just to my heart, but to my skin." His hands had trembled slightly as he adjusted the seams, loosening tight linings and softening collars where the fabric bit cruelly into her neck. It was a subtle act of defiance, one he dared not speak of openly. Yet in that small kindness, Elias felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps grief need not be a shackle, a prison of cloth and custom. Outside, the mourners drifted like phantoms through the misty streets. Their garments rustled softly, a chorus of whispered laments carried on the cold air. Children peered from behind curtains, and shopkeepers lowered their shutters, acknowledging the somber procession with bowed heads. In this city, sorrow was a currency exchanged in fabric and ceremony, and Elias was both a participant and an observer, caught between the threads of tradition and the stirrings of change. As the evening deepened, a knock came at the door, hesitant and muffled. Elias opened it to find a young woman, her face pale and eyes wide with unspoken grief. She held in her hands a length of black lace, worn and delicate. "Can you help me?" she asked softly. "I need to wear my sorrow, but it chokes me." Elias nodded, a quiet resolve settling over him. "Come in," he said. "Let us see what can be done." Thus began the first stitch in a tapestry of rebellion, woven from threads of empathy and danger. Elias knew the path ahead was fraught with peril. To tamper with grief was to challenge the very fabric of society. Yet he could no longer ignore the call to ease the burden borne by so many. The candle guttered as the night deepened, shadows dancing upon the walls like restless spirits. Outside, the city slumbered beneath its shroud of sorrow, unaware that a quiet revolution was beginning and a tailor's humble shop a revolution that might one day unravel the gilded grief that bound them all. Even now, Elias's fingers itched to loosen the stitches of oppression, to thread a new pattern of mourning, one where sorrow was felt, not worn. The first step was small, almost invisible, but it was enough to set the wheels in motion, to pull at the seams of a society wrapped tight in its own sorrowful guise. And so, beneath the dim glow of a single candle, amidst the scent of damp fabric and whispered prayers, Elias began to sew not just garments but the fragile beginnings of freedom. The streets outside whispered with the weight of countless stories, each cloaked in the heavy fabric of grief. Yet within the walls of the little shop, a different story was unfolding, one stitched with hope, courage, and the promise that even the deepest sorrow could be reshaped. As Elias worked late into the night, the city held its breath, caught between the past it clung to and the future that awaited just beyond the fog. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the cobblestones of Fleet Street, a damp, ghostly veil that muffled the usual clamor of Victorian London. Elias stood near the entrance of St. Bartholomew's, his breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. Around him, a procession wound steadily toward the church, a river of black silk, velvet, and lace, the physical manifestation of sorrow weighed down by rigid customs. The mourners moved with a somber grace, their garments heavy and intricate, each fold and embellishment a testament to the expectations imposed by society. Elias's eyes traced the figures as they passed, women in tightly corseted dresses layered beneath veils as dark as night, men whose coats bore jet black trim and mourning bands on their hats. The clack of polished boots echoed off the stone walls, mingling with the whispers and stifled sobs that floated on the damp air. He noted the way the garments seemed less a comfort and more a shackle. Lady Margaret Ashford, the recently widowed aristocrat, moved with measured steps, her breath shallow, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edges of her veil. He had crafted Lady Margaret's grief garment himself, a commission that had paid handsomely, yet he knew from her pallid expression that the dress was less a balm for her sorrow and more a cage. The corset pressed mercilessly against her ribs, the layers of fabric trapping heat and restricting movement. Elias's chest tightened with an ache not unlike grief as he imagined the suffocating pressure she endured not just from the garment but from the suffocating rituals it represented. Inside the church, the air was thick with incense and muted candlelight. Elias lingered near the back, watching the congregation file past the coffin draped in black velvet and silver embroidery. The mourners' faces were solemn masks, the weight of public expectation heavier than any garment. The clergy intoned prayers with measured cadence, their voices a steady drumbeat against the silence of loss. Elias's gaze caught Lady Margaret again. Her fingers clenched the armrest, knuckles white beneath the lace gloves. The funeral was a spectacle of material mourning, a ceremony where sorrow was worn as visibly as the finest jewels. Elias's mind churned with the contrast between external display and internal anguish. The grief garments were not merely clothing but instruments of social control, binding the bereaved to a strict script of suffering. He thought of the countless clients who had come to his humble shop, burdened not only by loss but by the physical agony of their mourning attire. After the service, at the reception held in the Ashford Estate's grand drawing room, Elias remained an observer in the shadows. The room buzzed with polite chatter and the clinking of fine china. Mrs. Adelaide Finch, a matron of considerable influence, presided over the gathering with an air of superiority. Her black silk gown shimmered under the gas lamps, adorned with jet beads that caught the light like tears frozen in stone. Elias overheard her sharp whispers, the judgments cast upon those whose grief garments betrayed even the slightest imperfection. A skirt that bunched too loosely, a veil that slipped too readily from the forehead. The ceremonial pressure was relentless. Mourning was a performance scrutinized at every turn. The thought of so many suffocating under these expectations stirred a fierce empathy within Elias. That evening, back in his workshop, a cramped, dimly lit room cluttered with scraps of fabric, spools of thread, and the faint scent of oil lamps, Elias set to work. His fingers, though stained with charcoal and dust, were deft as he carefully loosened the seams of a grief dress, sliding out the stiff linings that had made it a corset of pain. He replaced them with softer cloth, subtle in their presence but transformative in comfort. Each stitch was a quiet act of rebellion, a small defiance against the weight of tradition. Elias imagined the relief his modifications might bring, a secret comfort hidden beneath the watchful eyes of society. Yet he knew the risks. Tampering with grief garments was forbidden, a challenge to the mourning police who enforced the laws with unwavering rigor. As the nights passed, Elias experimented with fabrics and techniques, balancing the need for appearance with the desire for ease. His empathy grew alongside his determination. He began to see his craft not just as a means of survival, but as a mission to free others from the cruel tyranny of material sorrow. Outside, the city continued its restless pulse. The fog thickened, swallowing the street lamps in a haze of gray. Elias stood by his window, the muted glow reflecting in his thoughtful eyes. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and isolation, but the seed of a quiet revolution had taken root within his heart. Would the city ever embrace a lighter morning? Or was the weight of grief garments as eternal as sorrow itself? Elias did not yet know. But as he prepared his needle and thread for another night's work, he felt a flicker of hope, a promise woven into every stitch. And so, beneath the heavy shroud of Victorian mourning, a tailor began to unravel the threads of sorrow. The bell tolled midnight, the sound echoing hollowly through the narrow streets. Elias paused, his hands resting on the worn wooden table, scattered with patterns and scraps of fabric. The city slept, unaware of the quiet defiance blossoming in a little shop tucked between the gaslit alleys. Tomorrow, Lady Margaret would return for her altered garment. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would breathe a little easier beneath the weight of her grief. But the eyes of the mourning police grew ever sharper, and the dance of shadows and whispers was only beginning. Elias exhaled slowly, a thread of resolve weaving itself through the fabric of his soul. The weight of mourning was heavy, but so too was the will to change it. The night deepened, and in the silence a tailor stitched a new pattern of hope. The back room of Elias's tailoring shop was cloaked in dimness, a single flickering candle struggling against the encroaching shadows. The air was thick with the scent of damp cloth and the faint mustiness of aged leather. Elias sat hunched over a heavy mourning dress, the fabric weighed down by layers of black silk and stiff crinoline. His fingers, nimble despite the grime that coated them, worked steadily to loosen seams that society had deemed sacrosanct. Each stitch he carefully removed was a silent act of rebellion, a quiet defiance against the cruel rigidity of Victorian mourning customs. Outside, the streets of London murmured with the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the low murmur of passers-by, wrapped in their own sorrowful apparel. The city seemed to breathe grief as a living thing, its fog-laden alleys and gaslit corners veiling stories of loss and duty. Elias felt the weight of these stories pressing upon him, yet within the cramped confines of his workshop, he nurtured a fragile hope. His first client arrived on a bleak afternoon, the sky heavy with unrelenting gray clouds. Mrs. Abigail Harrow, a widow cloaked in the darkest mourning, entered timidly, her footsteps tentative on the worn wooden floor. Her eyes, shadowed with fresh sorrow, met Elias's with a mixture of desperation and trust. She confided, in a voice barely above a whisper, how the grief garment felt like a prison, constricting her not only in body, but in spirit. Elias listened, his heart aching beneath his careful composure. "There might be a way," he murmured, "to ease your burden without dishonoring your loss." He explained that he could subtly alter the dress, loosening the corset's tightening, removing the suffocating linings that pressed against her skin, yet still preserving the outward appearance demanded by society. Over the following days, Elias worked in secrecy, his needle threading a delicate balance between comfort and conformity. The back room became a sanctuary where grief was not a shackle but a fabric to be softened. He experimented cautiously, aware that discovery could mean ruin. The mourning police were vigilant, their patrols a constant reminder of the price of defiance. When Mrs. Harrow returned to be fitted, the transformation was palpable. As Elias adjusted the dress, he watched her shoulders relax, her breathing ease, and a faint spark of relief kindle in her eyes. "I can breathe again," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Their brief exchange was interrupted by a sudden creak from the street-facing door. Elias froze, heart pounding, as footsteps echoed nearby. He quickly concealed his tools and a small leather-bound journal filled with coded notes and sketches. The tension was suffocating, but the footsteps passed, and silence reclaimed the room. That night, Elias lay awake, the flickering candlelight casting restless shadows on the walls. He knew this was but the first stitch in a larger tapestry of resistance. Each altered seam was a step toward freedom, yet every success deepened the danger. Still, the image of Mrs. Harrow's eased grief propelled him forward. Days later, he watched from a fogged window as Mrs. Harrow walked away, her gait lighter, the oppressive weight of mourning visibly lifted. The city around him remained shrouded in sorrow, but within that small act of kindness, Elias glimpsed the possibility of change. He was no longer merely a tailor. He was an outlaw of emotion, a quiet architect of a rebellion woven in shadow and thread. And so, beneath the gaslit streets and beneath the watchful eyes of a society clinging to its rituals, Elias stitched his secret defiance. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but his resolve was stitched as firmly as the seams he dared to loosen. The heavy cloak of grief would not bind them forever. The night deepened, and Elias's thoughts drifted to the unknown clients who might one day seek his aid. He wondered how many more would dare to reclaim their sorrow from the suffocating grasp of material mourning. With each stitch, the city's fabric might fray, unraveling centuries of ceremony and pain. But the question lingered, persistent and sharp: how long before the unseen seamstress became the hunted? The answer lay hidden in the shadows of London's fog, where grief was worn and rebellion quietly sown beneath the surface. Elias picked up his needle once more, the thread gleaming faintly in the candlelight. The first stitches in secret had been made. Now the real work began. The evening fog crept through the narrow streets of Whitechapel, curling around lampposts and muffling the clatter of footsteps on the cobblestones. Elias's shop, a modest hovel wedged between a bakery and a pawnshop, seemed no different from the countless others lining the grimy thoroughfare. Yet inside, a quiet revolution was taking root beneath the flickering candlelight. Elias stood hunched over his work table, the scent of damp wool and thread thick in the air. Before him lay a grief garment black silk with heavy linings and stiffened collars, the physical manifestation of a loss both personal and societal. His fingers, nimble and practiced, traced the seams, loosening threads with delicate care. Beside him sat Martha, a widow from the East End, her face pale and drawn but softened by a glimmer of hope. "Will it truly ease the weight, Mr. Elias?" she whispered, voice barely audible over the crackle of the candle. He gave a small, reassuring smile. "It will breathe with you, Martha. You need not be crushed beneath it." The first modification was subtle, a loosened seam here, a lighter lining there, but it was enough to grant Martha a fleeting sensation of freedom. Word, as it often did in the dense neighborhoods of London, traveled swiftly. Soon, Elias found more visitors arriving in the muted hours of twilight, their faces shadowed by grief and desperation. Among them was Lily, a sprightly messenger with quick feet and a sharper mind. She became the unseen seamstress's voice in the alleys and tenements, spreading whispered tales of relief and rebellion. Her cloak, dark as the midnight sky, shielded her from prying eyes as she passed secret notes and arranged clandestine meetings, but the city was not blind. The morning police, a rigid and unforgiving force charged with upholding the sanctity of grief, began to notice inconsistencies. Inspector Caraway, a man whose iron will matched the somber uniform he wore, was first to connect the dots. Reports of mourners whose garments moved with unnatural ease, whose sobbing seemed less burdened, reached his desk with increasing frequency. One evening, Caraway observed a gathering in a public square where a widow's dress betrayed signs of alteration, seams too pliant, fabrics too soft. His eyes narrowed, suspicion igniting like a fire beneath his stern demeanor. "Something festers beneath the surface," he muttered, turning back to his papers littered with complaints and surveillance notes. Back in his workshop, Elias wrestled with the growing peril. The thrill of his small victories was shadowed by the weight of impending discovery. The coded journals he kept, filled with diagrams and secret notations, were both his pride and his vulnerability. Each entry was a stitch in a tapestry of defiance, but also a thread that could unravel everything. The nights grew longer, the streets colder, and the city's grief more palpable. Yet, in the depths of shadowed rooms and whispered confidences, Elise's network blossomed. For every tightened seam there was a heart unburdened. For every risk taken, a seed of hope planted. And as the morning police's gaze sharpened, Elias knew the time to tread lightly was slipping away. The unseen seamstress was becoming an outlaw, her needle poised to cut through the very fabric of Victorian sorrow. The candle guttered, casting long shadows that danced upon the walls like silent witnesses to a rebellion stitched in silence. Elias paused, hand resting on a garment half-finished, and whispered to the empty room, "They may hunt the body, but they cannot bind the spirit." Outside, the fog thickened. The city held its breath. And so, beneath the veil of night, the threads of a new dawn began to weave themselves into the tapestry of London's grief. The fog rolled thick and unyielding through the cobbled streets of London, muffling the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the distant tolling of church bells. Inside his modest shop, Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, the scent of damp wool and linseed oil mingling in the air. The day's work had been tedious, fitting yet another elaborate grief garment for a client of the upper class. But his mind was elsewhere restless, turning over the secret alterations he had made in recent weeks. His fingers ached from the fine stitching required to subtly loosen seams and remove suffocating linings, small acts of rebellion against the rigid mourning customs that strangled the city. Yet the weight of these visible sorrows was not merely physical. It pressed on the spirit, binding the bereaved in chains of expectation and public display. A sharp knock at the door startled him. He glanced toward the street through the grimy windowpane, where a figure stood framed by the flickering gaslight. She was unlike any client he had seen, a woman cloaked in a grief garment that shimmered with an uncommon hue of deep, indigo velvet embroidered delicately with silver threads that caught the light like tears frozen in fabric. Her dark curls framed a face pale but resolute, eyes shadowed by sorrow deeper than mere loss. Elias felt a pang of recognition, not just of her grief, but of the stories woven silently into the fabric she wore. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice low yet steady. "I have heard whispers of your talents." Elias hesitated, the weight of danger pressing upon him, but something in her gaze compelled trust. "You seek relief." She nodded, stepping inside with a cautious grace. Mrs. Fenwick, his assistant, watched silently from the back, her hands folded tightly. In the cramped back room, surrounded by spools of thread and scraps of mourning cloth, Madeleine Grayso, she introduced herself, spoke quietly of her loss. Not of death, but of a love suffocated by society's expectations and cruel silences. "My grief is not only for a life lost," she confided, "but for the freedom I no longer possess." Elias listened, heart tightening as the truth of her words settled like dust in the air. The grief garment she wore was no mere shroud of death. It was a cage stitched from sorrow and lies, a costume demanded by a world that refused to see the complexity of human pain. He examined the embroidery, running his fingers gently over the silver threads. Each stitch seemed to pulse with a story, a hidden tear, a suppressed cry. Here was sorrow as a language, as a prison. "I can ease this burden," Elias promised, "but it will not be without risk." Madeleine's eyes met his, flames of defiance and hope flickering within. "Then I entrust you with my truth." As days turned to nights, Elias worked tirelessly, crafting alterations that allowed the garment to breathe without betraying its mournful appearance. He wrestled with the complexity of his task, not merely to alter fabric, but to honor the profound depths of human sorrow while offering respite. Word of this mysterious woman and her unusual garment spread cautiously among Elias's secret clients, adding a new layer of urgency and meaning to his work. Each stitch, each seam altered, became an act of quiet rebellion against the unyielding ceremonial pressure that demanded grief be worn as a visible, unshakable weight. One evening, as Madeleine prepared to leave, Elias felt the heavy silence between them. The gas lamps outside flickered uncertainly, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. "Why do you do this?" she asked so softly. He considered the question, the city's sorrow pressing in from every street corner. "Because beneath these garments lie stories that deserve to be heard, not hidden. Because grief must not be a prison." Her farewell was a whispered promise to return, a silent pact forged in shared understanding. Alone in the dim light, Elias felt the stirrings of something new, a resolve to delve deeper, to unravel the tangled threads of grief woven into society's fabric. But with that resolve came the sharp edge of danger. Each act of defiance risked exposure, and the morning police's scrutiny grew ever more vigilant. Elias knew the path ahead was fraught, yet the glimpse of freedom in Madeline's eyes kindled a flame he could not extinguish. And so, beneath the weight of fog and sorrow, the tailor who altered grief stepped further into the shadows, weaving a new narrative from threads of lies and truth. The night outside thickened, and Elias's workshop stood as a quiet beacon, a place where grief might one day be worn not as a burden, but as a testament to the resilience of the human heart. But the city was restless, and secrets were never safe for long. The game had changed, and Elias was no longer merely a tailor. He was a weaver of hope amid the darkest fabric of Victorian morning. Still, questions lingered in the heavy air. How far could he go before the seams of society tore irreparably? And what price would freedom demand from those bound in sorrow? The answers lay hidden, stitched between shadow and light, waiting to be unraveled. The flickering candle cast long shadows on the cramped walls of Elias's back room, where the air was thick with the mingled scents of damp wool, beeswax, and the faint tongue of ink. Elias hunched over his workbench, fingers moving with a practiced precision that belied the tremor in his chest. Martha was beside him, her sharp eyes catching every detail as they altered yet another grief garment. This one for a client who could barely move beneath its weighty folds. "The seams here," Elias murmured, pointing to a tight stitch at the shoulder. "It's meant to constrict, to bind the wearer in sorrow. But if we loosen it just a touch, they breathe." "They carry grief, yes, but not the burden?" Martha nodded, her needle darting through the fabric. "The lining is all wrong, stiff and suffocating. Silk would be better, soft, but no one dares speak of comfort in mourning." Elias's gaze flickered to the cracked window where the London fog curled like a living thing outside, swallowing the gas lamps and muffling the city's restless sounds. "Comfort," he said softly, "is a revolution stitched in silence." Months had passed since Elias first dared to meddle with the rigid customs that dictated grief as visible physical attire. The city's elite and commoners alike were bound by the unyielding laws of mourning, their sorrow worn like armor-heavy, unyielding, and public. Yet beneath this exterior, Elias saw a different truth. Grief was a private tempest, and to wear it as a public shroud invited suffering beyond the heart's own. His first secret modifications had been small, a loosened seam here, a less restrictive sleeve there, but now, emboldened by the quiet relief of those few who sought him out, Elias crafted entire garments that carried the outward appearance of mourning, yet concealed a newfound ease. The heavy blacks were interwoven with subtle textures that softened the weight. The stiff collars became pliable, allowing breath and movement, and the linings whispered comfort against the skin. All the while, Elias encoded his methods in a journal, bound in plain leather, its pages filled with symbols and shorthand understood only by him and Martha. This book was their lifeline, a blueprint for a future where grief might be honored without chains. Tonight, as rain tapped a steady rhythm against the shop's window panes, Elias paused to listen. Footsteps echoed faintly above the patrols of the morning police, ever vigilant. The city's guardians of sorrow were growing suspicious. There had been murmurs of altered garments, of mourners moving too freely, too comfortably. "We must be cautious," Elias whispered, closing the journal and slipping it beneath a loose floorboard. They watched for any sign of defiance. Martha glanced toward the ceiling, her eyes sharp, but they cannot stop what they cannot see. Our work is stitched into every fold, every thread that carries hope. Days later, at a grand funeral on Fleet Street, Elias watched from a respectful distance as the crowd gathered beneath the grim skies. The mourners were draped in the traditional heavy garments, their movements stiff and measured, faces etched with sorrow and silent obligation. Among them, however, Elias noticed a few who moved with a subtle grace, their attire seeming to breathe with them, allowing a small, almost imperceptible ease in their bearing. A pang of pride warmed his chest. His clandestine craft was seeping through the cracks of society's rigid mourning. yet pride was tempered by caution. Inspector Harrow, the stern officer charged with enforcing grief regulations, had begun frequenting Elias's shop under the guise of a client. His keen eyes and probing questions were a reminder that Elias's rebellion teetered on a knife's edge. One afternoon, as Elias fitted a garment for a widow whose eyes glistened with fresh tears, the doorbell chimed softly. Inspector Harrow stepped inside, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Good day, sir," Elias greeted, masking his unease with a polite nod. "How may I assist you?" Harrow's eyes scanned the shop, lingering on patterns and fabrics. "I hear you are the city's finest tailor for the morning. It's an honored position." Elias smiled thinly. "I do what I can to serve those in sorrow." The inspector's lips twitched in a semblance of a smile. "I trust your work upholds the dignity our customs demand." "It must," Elias agreed, though his heart quickened. He had learned to cloak his defiance in deference, but the threat was ever present. As Harrow left, Elias exhaled slowly, the weight of his double life settling anew on his shoulders. That night, beneath the lantern's glow in the hidden back room, Elias and Martha pored over the journal, planning new designs garments that would continue to challenge the suffocating norms while flying just beneath the morning police's radar. "We are becoming patterns of defiance," Elias said quietly, stitch by stitch, seam by seam. Martha smiled, the flicker of candlelight catching the determination in her eyes. "And soon the city will wear a different sorrow, one of freedom." Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the gas lamps and the city's secrets alike. In the silence, the threads of rebellion were being woven, unseen but unyielding. And so Elias's journey deepened, the tailor who dared to unbind grief one garment at a time, setting the stage for a revolution stitched in shadow and hope. The day had begun like any other, the muffled clatter of needles and scissors punctuating the dim light that filtered through the grimy windows of my shop. The scent of damp wool and stiffened silk hung thick in the air, a constant reminder of the garments I fashioned for those shackled by sorrow. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, a taut thread of unease wound through me. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. The fog curled like fingers around the gas lamps, and the streets whispered of approaching shadows. I was hunched over a half-finished grief coat, fingers deftly easing a restrictive seam when the sharp rap of boots against wood shattered the fragile quiet. The door burst open before I could rise, and there stood Inspector Mallory, his cold gaze sweeping the cramped room, flanked by two grim-faced men of the morning police. The weight of their presence pressed down like the very garments I crafted, suffocating and relentless. "Elias," Mallory's voice was low, edged with accusation. "We have reports of illicit modifications to grief garments circulating through the district. We intend to search your premises." My heart thundered in my chest, but I forced a calm I did not feel. "You'll find nothing but honest tailoring here, Inspector." He smirked, stepping forward as his men began rifling through bolts of fabric and half-stitched coats. I exchanged a quick glance with Miriam, my trusted apprentice, who had slipped quietly into the back room. Her eyes were wide, but steady. The unspoken question passed between us how to escape this tightening noose. As Mallory's men lifted a pile of mourning veils, I saw my chance. A loose floorboard, a narrow crawl space beneath the shop, an escape route I'd never dared use. Timing was everything. With a practiced calm, I muttered a distracted apology and slipped away, the sharp scent of mothballs and damp wood fading as I dropped into the shadowed crawl space. The world above was filled with the harsh clamor of boots and the harsh commands of the police. I wriggled forward, heart hammering, ears straining for footsteps. The cold earth pressed against my face, mingled with the musky scent of old fabric and dust. Outside, the muffled shouts and clinking of metal echoed through the fog-laden streets. Emerging into an alley slick with rain and grime, I melted into the darkness. The city's night swallowed me, a blur of gaslight halos and whispering fog. Behind me, the morning police combed the streets, their hunt growing fiercer. Later, in the cramped safety of a hidden loft, Miriam and I gathered around a flickering candle. The soft glow cast long shadows on the walls, mingling with the scent of smoke and fresh cloth. We spoke in hushed tones, weaving plans and secret codes into our work, each stitch a silent act of rebellion. "They're closing in," Miriam whispered, her fingers trembling slightly. But there are still those who need us. I nodded, resolve hardening beneath the weight of exhaustion. We must be smarter, quieter. The city's grief is a web of control, but even the tightest net has its loose strands. We will find them. Days later, atop a rooftop overlooking the sprawling expanse of Victorian London, I stood alone. Below, the fog wreathed the streets like restless spirits, gas lamps flickering through the mist. The city pulsed with sorrow, its people bound by invisible chains woven from tradition and ceremony. I clenched my fist, the cool night air biting at my skin. The morning police sought to enforce conformity, to make misery a public spectacle, a material burden to be worn and judged. But grief, I had learned, was not a garment to be tailored or torn away. It was a fire within the soul, fierce and untamed. Yet, if I could ease the weight of that fire, even just a little, perhaps I could kindle a new kind of freedom. One thread at a time, one stitch in secret, I would unravel their control. The stakes had never been higher. But so too was my resolve. The tangled web of authority would not hold me forever. Tonight, the city slept beneath its gilded grief, but tomorrow it might begin to dream of liberty. And with that thought, I vanished into the night, a shadow among shadows, bound to a cause that demanded everything. In the chill of early evening, Elias sat hunched over his worn wooden table, the flicker of candlelight casting uneasy shadows across the cluttered room. The scent of damp wool mingled with the faint musk of old leather and beeswax. Before him lay a length of the deepest black velvet he had ever dared to work with, luxurious and heavy with promise. This commission was unlike any before. Lady Isabel Harrington, a widow of impeccable status and whispered tragedy, had sought his help not to ease the weight of grief in the usual manner, but to mask it entirely beneath a veil of opulence. The city beyond his small workshop was a restless murmur of fog and gaslight, but within these four walls, Elias wove a different tale. Each stitch was deliberate, a secret rebellion hidden beneath the guise of elegance. He cut the fabric with precision, designing internal linings of silk and cotton, so light they whispered against the skin, relieving the burden of traditional mourning garb. Hidden within the folds were pockets and panels that allowed Lady Isabel to move freely unseen by the prying eyes of society's mourning police. Elise's fingers, though calloused and stained with ink and thread, moved with the grace of a seasoned craftsman, each seam a silent oath of protection. He was no longer just a tailor. He was a guardian of forbidden's relief, threading hope into every fiber. When Lady Isabel arrived for the first fitting, the air in the workshop thickened with restrained emotion. She was the epitome of Victorian Greystall, poised, her raven black hair gleaming under the dim light. Her eyes, however, told a different story, a tempest of sorrow tightly bound beneath a mask of aristocratic composure. As she slid into the garment, her fingers trembled slightly, tracing the luxurious folds as if seeking solace in the fabric itself. "It is exquisite," she whispered, voice barely audible. "But more than that, it is freedom." Elias met her gaze, understanding the weight behind her words. This gown was more than cloth. It was a shield, a statement of defiance against the suffocating expectations of their world. Their collaboration flourished quietly in the days that followed, each fitting a delicate dance of trust and discretion. Yet the very success of Elise's work sowed the seeds of danger. Word of the sumptuous yet freeing garment spread like wildfire through whispered salons and behind closed doors. At a lavish reception held in the gilded halls of Harrington Manor, Elias watched from the shadows as Lady Isabel entered, draped in the velvet veil he had crafted. The flicker of chandeliers caught the rich fabric's sheen, drawing admiring glances from the assembled elite. Yet beneath the glamour, Elias sensed the undercurrent of suspicion. Society's guardians of mourning customs were not blind to such innovation. It was here, in a dim corridor away from the prying eyes of guests, that Elias encountered Mr. Pembroke, the stern, impeccably dressed man known as the enforcer of ceremonial mourning. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, bore into Elias with a warning cloaked in civility. "Mr. Elias," Pembroke began, voice low and measured, "your talents are undeniable. Yet one must ask, at what cost do these new fashions come? The sanctity of grief is not to be trifled with." Elias held his ground, feeling the weight of the unspoken threat. "I only seek to ease the burden, sir." to offer those who suffer a measure of relief. Pembroke's gaze hardened and a shadow flickered across his features. Relief, yes, but relief that skirts the law and the very fabric of our society. Be cautious where your stitches lead. The encounter left Elias with a chill deeper than the London fog. His work had crossed into dangerous territory, elevating him from a humble craftsman to a marked man in the eyes of the elite. Yet, beneath the looming threat, a spark of hope kindled. If a grief garment could conceal sorrow beneath such sumptuousness, perhaps it could also conceal the seeds of change. As the night deepened, Elias returned to his workshop, the velvet draped across his lap like a silent promise. He knew the path ahead was fraught with peril, but the promise of freedom for Lady Isabel, for the grieving masses, was a call he could not ignore. The city's shadows lengthened, but within the heart of a poor tailor, a new tapestry of defiance was being woven one stitch at a time. And as the gas lamps flickered against the encroaching darkness, Elias resolved to wear his rebellion like the finest garment of velvet veil, hiding not sorrow, but unyielding hope. The evening air clung thick with fog and the faint scent of rain as I approached the grand townhouse on Grosvenor Square. My heart thudded unevenly beneath my threadbare waistcoat. This was a world far removed from the cramped alleys and flickering lamplight of my humble shop. Yet tonight, necessity and a flicker of hope propelled me forward. The door opened before I could knock, revealing a slender figure draped in the customary black that marked the living dead of London's grief-bound elite. "You are Elias." Her voice was soft, yet carried the unquestionable weight of command. I inclined my head. "Yes, my lady, I am honored to meet you." Lady Isabel Hawthorne's eyes, shadowed beneath her mourning bonnet, held a storm of sorrow and something else, a spark that stirred something unfamiliar in my chest. "I have heard of your talents," she said, her gaze searching. "And I believe we share a sentiment regarding the burdens our society forces upon its bereaved." Her words were an invitation, a fragile thread extended across the chasm of our worlds. In that dimly lit parlor, heavy with the scent of wax candles and the sharp tongue of black dye, we spoke in hushed tones. She revealed the suffocating expectations placed upon her since her husband's passing, the endless layers of velvet and silk that trapped her like a gilded cage, the unyielding gazes that measured her sorrow by the weight of her garments. I told her of my secret endeavors, the subtle loosening of seams, the removal of stifling linings, the clandestine hope sewn into each stitch. She listened, eyes brightening with a cautious hope that mirrored my own. Our alliance was born in whispers and shadows, yet it carried the promise of change. Over the following weeks, Lady Isabel became both muse and partner. In my cramped workshop, the smell of fabric and thread mingled with her delicate perfume as she tried on a modified grief gown. The garment retained its somber appearance but allowed her a freedom of movement long denied. A fragile smile broke through her veil of sorrow, a quiet rebellion against the chains that bound her. Together we plotted subtle subversions. Coded messages woven into fabric swatches passed between us like secret letters, exchanged in shadowed gardens beneath the watchful gaze of the moon. Each stitch and fold a word in our silent dialogue, each thread a promise of defiance. Our most daring act came at a formal morning gathering, a sea of black veils and heavy silks weighed down by ritual and expectation. From the crowd, I watched as Lady Isabel, poised and serene, subtly loosened the sash that cinched her grief gown. It was a silent declaration, a crack in the facade of enforced sorrow, unnoticed by all but me. The risk was immense. Discovery would mean ruin, for her, for me, for the fragile movement we nurtured. Yet the act was electric with courage, a beacon for those suffocated by the strictures of mourning. In the days that followed, whispers of hope spread quietly through the city's upper circles. The alliance of a poor tailor and a grieving aristocrat became a symbol of possibility, challenging the rigid customs that bound us all. But even as our network grew, so did the shadows of suspicion. The mourning police, ever vigilant, tightened their gaze. Trust became as precious and fragile as the finest silk. Betrayal lurked behind every curtsy and polite smile. I found solace in the knowledge that we had sown a seed, a thread of trust that, if nurtured, could unravel the suffocating tapestry of our society's grief. Yet the question lingered like a chill wind through the fogged streets. How far could we push before the seams burst irrevocably, and the full weight of consequence fell upon us? The night deepened, and with it my resolve. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril. But for the first time in many moons, it was illuminated by the quiet light of hope. The morning fog clung to the cobblestones like a shroud as the city gathered for the funeral procession of Lord Hargrave, a man esteemed for his lineage and wealth. Amidst the sea of somber faces draped in layers of black, the figure of Lady Beatrice Halcombe stood out not for rebellion, but for the elegance of her mourning attire. Her grief garment, a creation whispered about in the underground circles, concealed the subtle alterations that Elias had painstakingly crafted. It was a garment designed to comfort without conforming to the suffocating rigidity of societal demands. But comfort was a dangerous luxury in Victorian London, where grief was as public as the streets themselves. Word had already begun to spread, though faintly, about illegal modifications to grief garments. The mourning police, vigilant and unforgiving, had been tracking anomalies with increasing suspicion. Today, that suspicion found its proof. As the procession wound its way through the city's heart, a sharp-eyed official noticed the delicate easing of seams on Lady Beatrice's sleeve, a deviation from the strict codes. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, curiosity blooming into scandal. The whispered accusations grew louder, and soon the entire gathering was abuzz with the revelation. Lady Beatrice was wearing a grief garment altered by Elias's forbidden techniques. Inspector Thaddeus Crane, the grim sentinel of mourning law, wasted no time. His presence was immediate and imposing, a dark shadow cast over the once dignified procession. "This is an affront to tradition," he declared, voice booming over the gathered masses. "Such defiance cannot be tolerated." The scandal ignited a firestorm. Newspapers seized upon the story, painting Elias as a dangerous subversive corrupting the sacred rites of mourning. The mourning police intensified their patrols, conducting raids and arrests with ruthless efficiency. Elias's network, once a whispered hope in the city's dim corners, was now the hunted prey. Within the fragile sanctuary of his shop, Elias felt the walls closing in. The trust he had placed in his apprentices was shattered when Margot's name surfaced among the informers. The betrayal stung deeper than the cold bite of the morning air outside. One evening, beneath the veil of twilight and the steady drizzle of rain, Elias confronted Margot in a narrow alley behind the market. The dim glow of a gas lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the wet stones. Her eyes darted nervously, the weight of guilt pressing down like the heavy folds of a grief garment she no longer wished to wear. "Why, Margot?" Elias's voice was low, edged with hurt. "We trusted you." She swallowed hard, voice trembling. "I had no choice. They threatened my family." The ache of betrayal mingled with empathy, but Elias knew there was no turning back. The fragile threads of his rebellion were unraveling, and with them the hope of a gentler morning. As dawn broke, the mourning police descended upon Elias's shop. The clang of iron gates and the shouted commands tore through the stillness. His apprentices fled into the labyrinthine streets, shadows melting into fog. Elias slipped through a hidden door at the rear, heart pounding, mind racing. Climbing to the rooftop, he gazed upon a London cloaked in mist, the city of sorrow and secrets. The distant chimneys exhaled smoke like silent mourners, and the river reflected the pale sky, a mirror to the unrest stirring beneath. In that moment, Elias felt the weight of the world's grief pressing upon him, yet beneath it, a spark of defiance flickered. The customs might unravel, but from the frayed edges, perhaps a new pattern could be woven, one where sorrow was felt deeply, yet not worn as a cage. The chapter closed not with resolution, but with a question hanging in the damp air. How far would Elias go to protect the fragile hope of freedom, and at what cost would the fabric of society finally tear? The scandal surrounding Lady Beatrice's altered grief garment had set the city ablaze with tension. For weeks, Elias avoided the bustling markets and crowded taverns, his movements cautious and deliberate. His secret workshop had been compromised, and trust, once his greatest asset, had become his greatest vulnerability. Despite the fear and suspicion, whispers of Elias's work persisted among the lower classes. Mothers spoke in hushed tones of garments that soothed aching shoulders. Widowers nodded knowingly to one another about the subtle ease in their attire. Yet the public spectacle of mourning remained a harsh, unyielding demand, enforced by the relentless gaze of the mourning police. Elias found himself at a crossroads. The betrayal by Margot was a bitter pill, but it also revealed the reach and ruthlessness of the authorities. To continue, he would need new allies, new methods, and a deeper understanding of the social forces he was challenging. Late one evening, in the quiet of his dimly lit room, Elias pored over his coded journal. Each entry was a stitch in the tapestry of rebellion, a record of techniques, client stories, and reflections. Among the pages lay sketches of garments that promised freedom, designs that might one day redefine mourning itself. Yet the city was closing in. Inspector Crane's men prowled the streets, their boots echoing like ominous drums. Elias's heart beat with the rhythm of a fugitive, but his mind remained sharp, weaving plans as intricate as the finest embroidery. The unraveling of customs was underway, but Elias knew the final stitch was yet to be sewn. The next move belonged to him, one that could either mend the torn fabric of society or rend it beyond repair. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of the gas lamps and the ever-present fog, Elias prepared to face the coming storm, his resolve as unyielding as the iron gates that sought to imprison him. The story of grief and rebellion was far from over. As the city held its breath, Elias's name became a whispered legend, a shadow threading through the heart of Victorian London, challenging the age-old designs of sorrow and control. With every altered seam and every hidden stitch, Elias wove a new narrative, one where grief might someday be felt freely, without the oppressive weight of tradition. But first, he would have to survive the unraveling. Beneath the clamorous streets of Victorian London, where the weight of visible sorrow hung heavy over every passerby, a hidden light flickered in the shadows, a beacon for those who dared to dream of freedom from grief's oppressive garments. It was here, deep below the cobblestones and gas lamps, that Elias found refuge from the tightening noose of the mourning police. The narrow spiral staircase groaned beneath his careful footsteps as he descended into the subterranean chamber he had painstakingly fashioned into a workshop. The air was cool and thick with the scent of damp earth mingled with the sharp tang of freshly cut fabric. Bolts of black cloth stood like silent sentinels against the stone walls, and the soft hum of sewing machines echoed faintly, a quiet heartbeat of rebellion. Elias's eyes adjusted quickly to the dim glow of oil lamps scattered across the room, their flickering flames casting wavering shadows that danced like ghosts on the rough-hewn walls. Here, in this secret haven, the ritual of grief was transformed from a ceremony of oppression into an act of liberation. "Mara," Elias called softly, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Is the new loosening technique ready for demonstration?" From the far corner, Mara emerged, her dark curls escaping the loose knot that held them back. In her hands she cradled a grief garment, its heavy corseting and dense linings a cruel mockery of the wearer's freedom. With practiced care, she began to unravel the restrictive boning, whispering instructions as she worked. "The key," Mara murmured, "is to maintain the outward appearance, the solemnity the elite demand, while easing the suffocation beneath." Elias nodded, watching intently as the once rigid structure of the garment softened under her skilled fingers. The fabric seemed to breathe anew, promising comfort where only pain had dwelled. Nearby, Jonas, the youngest apprentice, observed with wide eyes, his fingers twitching nervously as if eager to assist but unsure where to begin. Elias smiled faintly. The boy's hesitation was a reminder of the risks they all faced. Outside, the city was alive with the sounds of mourning, the tolling of distant bells, the muffled sobs of the bereaved, and the relentless clatter of boots patrolling the fog-laden streets. The mourning police were growing restless, their vigilance sharpened by recent disturbances in grief garment compliance. One evening, as Elias wrapped a newly altered garment for a client, the sharp echo of footsteps above froze him mid-stitch. The shadows seemed to close in as the unmistakable clamor of a patrol approached. Heart-hammering, Elias slipped through a concealed door leading to a narrow tunnel, his breath shallow and quick. The boots thundered past the workshop entrance, oblivious to the fugitive artist hidden just beyond their reach. In that moment, Elias felt the fragile balance between hope and danger that defined their existence. Back within the safety of the hidden loom, the apprentices gathered around a battered wooden table, sharing whispered tales of clients freed from their heavy grief garments. Their voices were low, but vibrant with the promise of change, a chorus of quiet triumph rising against the suffocating silence imposed by society. "Each stitch we loosen," Mara said, eyes shining in the lamplight, "is a thread pulled from the fabric of their sorrow." Elias placed a hand over hers, a silent vow passing between them. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril, but beneath the city streets hope was being sown anew, one clandestine seam at a time. As the night deepened, Elias returned to his workbench, the flickering candlelight illuminating his determined face. In the shadows, the hidden loom whispered its promise, that grief, though heavy and demanding, need not be a shackle. Here, in this underground sanctuary, the seeds of rebellion took root, and a movement was born. Yet the question lingered like the ever-present London fog. How long could they hide before the morning police unraveled their secret? Elias's resolve hardened. Whatever the cost, the fight to reclaim grief's true meaning would not be silenced. And so, beneath the gaslit streets, the shadow tailor stitched the first threads of revolution. The evening had settled over London like a thick, suffocating veil, the gas lamps flickering weakly through the persistent fog that clung to the narrow streets. Inside the cramped backroom of his modest tailor's shop, Elias sat hunched over a battered wooden chair, the dim glow of a single candle casting long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. His eyes, bloodshot and weary, were fixed on the heavy garment folded in his lap, his own grief garment worn since the day Martha, his beloved sister, had passed from this world. The fabric was worn, its black silk dulled not only by time, but by the relentless weight of sorrow it represented. Where once the embroidery had shimmered with delicate threads, now it frayed, the seams stretched taut as if straining against the very body it cloaked. Elias traced the edges with a trembling finger, feeling the rough texture that had become a second skin, a prison woven from loss and tradition. He remembered the day he had first crafted that garment for Martha, a simple mourning ribbon, black as a raven's wing, tied gently around her wrist. Her smile had been soft, fragile, yet determined, a quiet defiance against the crushing demands of society. She had whispered to him then, "Make it light, Elias, for grief must not weigh so heavily on the soul." But the world had not listened. The city demanded its display of sorrow, each thread a testament to loss, each fold a public confession etched in cloth. And so Elias had worn his grief openly, a banner of mourning stitched tight around his chest. Yet tonight, in the solitude of shadows and silence, that garment felt less like a symbol and more like a chain, binding him to a past he longed to escape. His fingers, calloused yet gentle, began to work at the seams, loosening the tight stitches that held the fabric close. The task was painstaking, each pull threatening to unravel more than just thread. He hesitated, heart pounding, as if afraid that loosening the garment might release not only the cloth, but the sorrow itself. Outside, the muffled sounds of the city persisted, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the distant murmur of voices, the occasional bark of a street vendor hawking his wares. Yet inside, time seemed suspended, caught between the past and the possibility of change. Elias thought of the countless clients he had served, their faces etched with pain beneath layers of constricting cloth. He had seen the way their shoulders sagged under the weight of expectation, how their movements were stifled, how their grief became a spectacle. And now, in this quiet moment, he felt the burden of his own sorrow pressing down with equal force. A faint sound stirred him from his reverie, a whisper on the breeze, a memory of Martha's voice urging him onward. Light, she had said, not the heavy cloak of despair. With renewed determination, Elias worked through the night, carefully removing the restrictive linings, replacing heavy fabrics with lighter ones, and creating openings where there had been none. Each alteration was an act of rebellion, a stitch of hope sewn into the tapestry of grief. By dawn, the garment hung loosely from his frame, a shadow of its former weight. Elias stood before a cracked mirror, the first rays of morning filtering through the grimy window panes. He peeled the remnants of the grief garment from his shoulders, feeling the cold air kiss his skin for the first time in years. The liberation was intoxicating yet terrifying. To be seen without the mask of mourning was to expose the rawness beneath. He knew the risks. To unwear grief was to challenge not only social custom but the very fabric of Victorian society's control over emotion. The mourning police were relentless, and betrayal lurked in every shadow. Yet Elise's heart beat with a fierce hope that this act of personal defiance could kindle a flame for others burdened by their own sorrow. The day ahead promised uncertainty, danger, but also the possibility of transformation. Elias folded the altered garment with care and hid it beneath the floorboards of his shop, a secret testament to his resolve. In the stillness before the city awoke, he whispered a vow to the memory of Martha and to all those who suffered in silence. He would weave a new path through the threads of sorrow, one where grief was felt, honored, but no longer worn as a chain. And so, beneath the heavy fog and the watchful eyes of London, Elias prepared to step into the light of a future unbound by the fading embroidery of enforced mourning. The chill of the London evening clung to my bones as I slipped through the labyrinthine alleys of Whitechapel, the gas lamps casting eerie halos in the fog that curled like spectral fingers around the cobblestones. Tonight was no ordinary night. Beneath the surface of this somber city, a secret was stirring. One that promised to unravel the heavy threads binding us to sorrow, that heavy mantle we were forced to wear as if grief were a garment stitched onto our very skin. I descended the narrow iron staircase hidden behind a false wall in an abandoned warehouse. The scent of damp wood mingled with the faint aroma of beeswax candles, and the sharp tang of leather filled the air. Whispered voices echoed softly as I reached the chamber below, a cavernous room crowded with figures cloaked in varying shades of morning black. The flicker of lantern light danced across their faces, each etched with lines of pain and defiance. Mara was the first to greet me, her ash-colored hair pulled back tightly, the intricate patchwork cloak she wore embroidered with faded mourning symbols that told stories of loss and rebellion alike. She held out a delicate mourning veil, its black lace woven with hidden pockets, shimmering faintly under the candlelight. "This," she whispered, "conceals the sorrow without inviting prying eyes. A shield for the soul." I traced the intricate patterns with my fingers, marveling at the craftsmanship, each stitch a silent act of defiance. Around the room the murmurs grew louder as Jonah, a broad-shouldered man with a face weathered by soot and sorrow, recounted his narrow escape from the mourning police. His voice was low but urgent, each word weighted with the memory of close calls and the relentless pressure of the law. "They tighten their grip every day," he warned, "but we grow in numbers and in spirit. The city's shadows are ours now." Silas, the quiet craftsman at my side, adjusted his spectacles and produced a small, intricate clasp designed to silently release the oppressive heaviness of a grief garment. We tested it carefully, the mechanism clicking softly in the hush of the room. The flickering candlelight illuminated our determined faces, a small beacon of hope against the encroaching darkness. As the night deepened, stories flowed like threads weaving a tapestry of resistance. Each person shared their own tale of loss and the suffocating weight of societal expectations. Yet beneath the sorrow was a fierce resolve to reclaim grief as a private emotion, not a public shackle. My heart swelled with a mixture of hope and fear. Here, in this hidden market, I found kindred spirits who dared to dream of freedom from the gilded cage of mourning. But with every new ally, the risk of discovery grew. The mourning police were ever vigilant, their presence an ominous shadow over our burgeoning movement. Still, I resolved to carry on. For every stitch I unraveled, for every seam I loosened, we edged closer to a future where grief could be felt deeply yet worn lightly, if at all. The night's whispers faded as I ascended the staircase back into the fog, the city's sorrow pressing down once more, but now, beneath that weight, a spark of rebellion glowed fiercely within me. This clandestine gathering was but a single thread in a vast tapestry, but together we would weave a new pattern, one where mourning was no longer a garment forced upon the living, but a journey embraced on our own terms. And so the market of shadows thrived. a beacon of defiance in a city cloaked in grief, where each stolen moment and whispered secret wove the promise of liberation. Yet, as the first light of dawn crept over the Thames, a chilling thought settled in my mind. How long before the morning police would unravel our carefully stitched rebellion? And when that day came, would we stand united or be torn apart like fragile fabric caught in a storm? The answer lay in the strength of our bonds, and the courage to keep sowing hope into the darkest corners of Victorian London. The dusk settled over the city like a shroud, thick fog curling through the narrow alleys and choking the gaslights into pale halos. Inside the cramped workshop hidden beneath a ramshackle facade, Elias worked feverishly, the needle threading through fabric as his apprentices moved about quietly, the atmosphere taut with the urgency of secrecy. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wool and the faint metallic tang of pins and needles. A single candle flickered on the worn workbench, casting dancing shadows against the brick walls lined with bolts of mourning cloth. Mara lingered near the back, her hands trembling as she folded a half-finished garment. Her eyes flickered toward Elias, who bent over a complex alteration designed to ease the crushing pressure of a widow's grief cloak. She had learned much under his tutelage, becoming a deft seamstress and a trusted confidant. Yet beneath her calm exterior churned a storm of doubt and fear for herself, for the fragile network they had built, and for the consequences of their defiance. After weeks of weighing her conscience against the tightening noose of the morning police's pursuit, Mara had made a choice. Slipping quietly from the workshop's back door, she vanished into the misty streets, her silhouette swallowed by the night. The path she took was measured and deliberate, each footfall muffled by the wet cobblestones as she made her way through a labyrinth of shadowed alleys to the station where Sergeant Harrow awaited her report. The next morning broke cold and gray, the city still cloaked in a somber veil of fog. Within moments, the tranquility shattered, heavy boots pounded against wooden stairs. Lanterns bobbed like will-o'-the-wisps through the gloom. The morning police, clad in their dark uniforms, surged into the hidden workshop with brutal efficiency. Shouts of command and cries of alarm echoed off the brick walls, drowning the muffled protests of apprentices as they scrambled to conceal their illicit work. Elias stood amidst the chaos, the weight of betrayal crashing down upon him like a tempest. He caught Mara's eye for a fleeting moment as she stood with the officers, her face pale but resolute. The sting of treachery seared through him, compounded by the sight of his comrades shackled, clutching fragments of altered garments that symbolized their hope and resistance. Without hesitation, Elias ducked behind a heavy curtain, slipping through a narrow passage he had long kept for emergencies. His breath came in ragged gasps as he navigated the maze of tunnels beneath the city, the distant shouts and clanging of chains a grim soundtrack to his flight. Each step was a desperate gamble, every shadow a potential snare. The cold night air bit at his skin when he finally emerged into an alley, the first rays of dawn casting a pale light over the ruined remnants of his sanctuary. Kneeling among scattered scraps of fabric and shattered tools, Elias felt the crushing weight of loss settle over him. The workshop, once a beacon of defiance against the suffocating norms of grief, was reduced to ashes and ruin. Yet amid the wreckage, a fierce flame kindled within his heart. The betrayal had exposed the fragility of trust, but it had not extinguished his resolve. He would rebuild. He must, for in the seams of shattered loyalty lay the threads of a new resistance. One tempered by caution, but fueled by an unyielding desire to free the city from the gilded cage of mourning. The morning police might hunt him relentlessly, but Elias was no longer just a tailor, he was the shadow in the fabric of Victorian sorrow, stitching rebellion one clandestine thread at a time. As the city stirred awake, unaware of the tempest raging beneath its cobbled streets, Elias disappeared into the mist, a fugitive bound by grief and rebellion. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but his needle was steady and his cause more urgent than ever. The days that followed were a blur of whispered meetings and hidden safe-houses. Elias moved like a ghost through the city, gathering what remained of his loyal apprentices and forging alliances anew. Trust, once broken, was painstakingly rebuilt with cautious glances and veiled words. Each garment he crafted now bore not only the weight of sorrow, but the resilience of hope. Yet the shadow of Marat's betrayal lingered, a reminder that in a world where grief was law, rebellion came at a cost beyond the physical. Elias wrestled with the bitter knowledge that even those closest to him could falter under pressure, their loyalties torn between survival and solidarity. Despite the setbacks, whispers of his defiance spread through the underbelly of Victorian London. Those who had glimpsed the comfort of his altered grief garments sought him out in secret, their faces etched with longing for liberation. The morning police intensified their efforts, but Elias's network, though wounded, endured. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the window panes of a hidden room, Elias sat alone, tracing the delicate stitches on a newly fashioned garment. The fabric was lighter now, the seams more forgiving. It was a small victory against the unyielding oppression of ceremonial sorrow. His thoughts drifted to Mara, to the choices that had led to this fracture. Could forgiveness find a place in the heart of a man who bore the scars of betrayal? Or was the fabric of trust forever torn? As the candle flickered low, Elias resolved that his rebellion would persevere not through blind trust, but through the unbreakable conviction that grief should never be a prison. The city slept, but the threads of change were already weaving through its shadows, one clandestine stitch at a time. The city seemed different under the cloak of night, a murmur of shadows rather than the relentless clamor of day. Elias moved like a wraith through the narrow, twisting passages of Victorian London, his breath a visible wisp in the chilled air. The fog clung to the gaslit streets, blurring the edges of the world and offering him a rare kind of invisibility. Here, beneath the weight of stone and sorrow, he had shed the identity of a humble tailor and embraced something fiercer, the shadow tailor. Each step was measured, deliberate. The heavy grief garments that had once defined the mourners of London now whispered secrets to Elias' secrets. He was determined to unravel. His hands itched to work, to cut through the bindings of enforced sorrow that choked the city's heart. Tonight he was to meet Martha, his most trusted apprentice, and old Tom, the ragged informant who knew the city's undercurrents better than any official. They huddled beneath a flickering gas lamp, their faces half hidden in the mist, but alight with shared purpose. "The police grow restless," Martha whispered, her breath quick in the cold. "Graven's men are sniffing around more than ever." Elias nodded, eyes scanning the darkened street. "Then we must be swifter. Our work cannot falter now. People need us." His voice carried a quiet steel, forged in the fires of grief and rebellion. The workshop, tucked away in a forgotten cellar beneath an abandoned warehouse, was a sanctuary of shadows and whispered hope. Inside, the flickering candlelight danced across spools of black silk and threads of deepest charcoal. Elias set to work, fingers nimble despite the cold and fatigue. He carefully loosened the constricting seams of a mourning shawl, removing the stifling linings that pressed like a vice against the skin. Each stitch undone was a small act of defiance, a promise of relief for the bearer. Outside, the mourners' bells tolled a melancholy dirge that echoed through the silent streets. The sound was a reminder of the city's unyielding grip on sorrow, and of the risks Elias took with every clandestine alteration. Yet as he worked, a swell of determination rose within him. This was no longer mere tailoring. It was revolution woven in fabric. Suddenly a harsh clang shattered the fragile calm. Lanterns bobbed into view as the morning police, led by the formidable Inspector Graven, stormed the workshop. Their uniforms, stiff and imposing, seemed to swallow the dim light, their faces masks of grim authority. "Search the premises," Graven barked. Chaos erupted. Elias grabbed the coded journal containing his methods, shoving it into the lining of his coat. Martha hurriedly concealed the tools beneath old scraps of grief cloth, while old Tom slipped through a hidden trapdoor, his patched coat blending with the darkness. The officers tore through the room, but Elias's quick thinking and intimate knowledge of the space allowed him to evade capture. Heart-pounding, he slipped out a back exit into the rain-slick alleyways, the cold biting through his threadbare coat. Breathless, he paused beneath a shadowed archway, listening to the fading footsteps of the raiding party. The city was still wrapped in sorrow, still shackled by its own customs, yet In the soft stirrings of dawn, Elias glimpsed something new. Mourners passed by, their grief garments subtly altered by his handiwork. Lighter fabrics, less confining, allowing tears to fall without suffocation. A faint smile touched his lips. The shadow tailor would not be undone. His craft had become a beacon for those who dared to hope beyond the gilded cage of mourning. Though hunted, he was no longer alone. His rebellion was a stitch in the fraying fabric of Victorian society. And as the first pale light spilled over London's rooftops, Elias vanished into the labyrinth of streets, ready to weave the next chapter of defiance. Night cloaked London in its familiar shroud of mist and muted lamplight, a perfect veil for those who sought to move unseen. Elias felt the weight of the darkness settle around him like a second skin, offering protection and peril in equal measure. The transformation from day's tailor to night's outlaw was complete, and with it, a new purpose ignited within his weary soul. His shop, once a humble haven where grief was meticulously sewn into every seam, had become a crucible for revolution. The secret workshop beneath the city pulsed with quiet energy, a place where sorrow was not a prison but a fabric to be unraveled and rewoven. Martha's arrival was as silent as the falling fog. Her sharp eyes met his with a mixture of concern and resolve. "The police are tightening their noose," she murmured, glancing over her shoulder. "Graven himself has taken an interest." Elias's jaw tightened. Inspector Graven, with his imposing presence and unyielding dedication to the mourning laws, was the embodiment of the city's oppression. Every encounter with him edged closer to disaster. Yet fear was a luxury Elias could no longer afford. "Then we must be shadows sharper than their reach," Elias replied, unfolding a battered map speckled with marks denoting safe houses, contacts, and escape routes. "Our work must continue more covert, more precise." They bent over the map, plotting the next steps of their defiance. Each mark was a promise to a mourner burdened by the heavy, suffocating garments that society demanded they wear to display their sorrow. Elias's alterations, subtle loosenings, hidden linings, secret cuts offered relief, a whisper of freedom beneath the watchful eyes of the mourning police. Hours later, the room hummed with quiet activity. Elias moved with practiced grace, his fingers deftly loosening a collar that had strangled its wearer for weeks. The scent of damp wool mingled with the faint aroma of beeswax from the candle, creating an atmosphere thick with purpose. Suddenly, a sharp sound shattered the unmistakable clatter of boots on stone. Lanterns flickered through the doorway as Inspector Graven's men burst in, faces set like stone. The raid was swift and merciless. "Scatter," Elias hissed, grabbing his journal and darting toward the concealed exit. Martha and old Tom vanished into shadows, their muffled curses swallowed by the chaos. The mourners' garments, symbols of their grief and Elias's rebellion, lay scattered like fallen leaves. Out in the alley, rain slicked the cobblestones, glistening like scattered tears. Elias pressed his back against the cold brick, breath ragged but spirit unbroken. Somewhere in the distance, the bells tolled mournfully, a reminder of the city's unyielding sorrow. Yet amidst the darkness, a spark of hope flickered. The garments he had altered, worn by mourners now walking freer, lighter, beneath the watchful dawn, were a testament to the change he had begun. The shadow tailor was no longer just a man, he was a symbol. And symbols, once born, are hard to extinguish. Elias's nights became a dance of shadows and whispers. Each operation was a delicate balance of risk and reward, weaving through the city's veins like a secret thread. The mourners he helped carried his work silently, their eased burdens a subtle rebellion against the suffocating demands of Victorian grief. Yet with every daring act the noose tightened. Inspector Graven's patrols grew more frequent, more ruthless. The mourning police's lanterns probed the darkness, searching for the elusive tailor who dared to challenge their authority. But Elias was the night itself unseen, unheard, yet ever present. His resolve was a tapestry of sorrow and hope, stitched with the knowledge that true freedom lay beyond the heavy fabric of enforced mourning. And as London slept under its shroud of grief, the shadow tailor wove the first threads of a new dawn. The rain had begun as a mere sprinkle, a gentle pattering that blurred the gaslit streets of London into a shimmering haze. But as the morning police closed in, their heavy boots echoing ominously against the cobblestones, the drizzle swelled into a relentless downpour. Elias's breath came in ragged gasps as hands gripped him roughly, dragging him through the slick streets. His threadbare coat, already soaked, clung to his frame, the cold seeping through every layer of fabric, biting at his skin. The faces of the officers were grim, their eyes unyielding, the weight of their duty pressing down like the very garments Elias sought to dismantle. He stumbled, the dampness making the cobbles treacherous beneath his worn boots. The city around him was a labyrinth of shadows and sorrow, the fog weaving through alleyways like a ghostly shroud. As they hauled him towards the station, Elias's mind raced, not with fear for himself alone, but for the countless souls shackled by the rigid expectations of mourning. His heart pounded not only from exertion, but from the looming question of what fate awaited him now. Days earlier he had not imagined that his quiet rebellion would lead him here. Yet the threads of his life were unraveling faster than he could stitch them back together. His secret workshop, hidden beneath the city's grime, had been compromised. Whispers of his illegal modifications had reached the ears of the morning police, and the crackdown was swift and merciless. Inside the dim, cold cell, Elias sat on a rough bench, the damp stone walls closing in like the very grief garments he sought to remove. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional murmur of footsteps. His fingers traced the worn seams of his coat, a tactile reminder of the life he was fighting to change. Then, unexpectedly, the heavy door creaked open. Captain Harrow appeared, his stern expression unyielding. Elias braced for the worst: trial, imprisonment, perhaps worse. But instead, a lady stepped through the doorway, her presence commanding and otherworldly in the austere chamber. Lady Agatha Whitmore, a figure whispered about in both high society and the shadowed alleys, regarded Elias with eyes that held a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "Release him," she commanded softly, yet with an authority that brooked no refusal. The captain hesitated but ultimately obeyed, unlocking the cell and stepping back. Elias rubbed his wrists, numb from confinement, as Lady Agatha led him through winding corridors to a carriage waiting outside. The journey to her estate was silent but charged with unspoken questions. As they entered her drawing room, lit by flickering candles that cast long shadows on the richly adorned walls, Elias took in the scene before him. Luxurious mourning garments hung on mannequins, each more ornate and elaborate than any he had dared to craft. Yet, beneath the finery, there was a palpable weight of heaviness that transcended fabric and thread. Lady Agatha's voice cut through his thoughts. "We are all prisoners of grief, Elias," she said quietly. "Whether wrapped in rags or velvet, the sorrow remains." Their conversation unfolded with delicate candor. She spoke of lost children, broken marriages, and the suffocating expectations of her class. Elias listened, the lines between them blurring. His rebellion was no longer against the garments alone, but against a society that demanded grief be worn as a spectacle, a cage gilded and ornate. As dawn crept over the London skyline, Elias stepped back into the mist-laden streets, the weight of new understanding settling upon him. He was free for now, but the path ahead was fraught with complexities he had yet to unravel. The gilded cage of sorrow encased all, and to dismantle it required more than skill with needle and thread. It demanded empathy, courage, and an unyielding resolve. The city stirred awake, unaware of the quiet revolution kindling in its heart. Elias melted into the fog, a shadow among shadows, carrying with him the fragile hope that grief might one day be felt, not worn. The air in the cramped workshop was thick with the scent of oil and damp wool, the faint flicker of candlelight casting elongated shadows that danced against the peeling wallpaper. Elias sat hunched over his workbench, the sharp silver blade in his hand trembling ever so slightly as it hovered above the coarse black ribbon that adorned the grief garment sample. Outside, the muffled sounds of Victorian London, horse-drawn carriages rattling over cobblestones, distant shouts, and the ever-present fog swallowing the gas lamps seemed to fade into a tense silence. He breathed in deeply and then, with a surgeon's precision, sliced through the ribbon. The cut was clean, almost imperceptible. No frayed edges, no telltale loose threads. He lifted the severed ribbon and let it fall silently onto the wooden table. His eyes gleamed. This was it, the breakthrough he had sought for months. A method to sever grief garments without detection, a literal cut at the very fabric of enforced sorrow. Martha, who had been quietly watching from the corner, stepped closer, her dark curls catching the candlelight. "You've done it," she whispered, voice trembling with excitement and fear. "No one will know," Elias nodded. "But every step forward invites the shadows to lengthen. The morning police will not ignore this for long." Their underground network had grown steadily, whispers of Elise's skill spreading through the lower classes and even creeping into the circles of the desperate elite. Each altered garment was a small act of rebellion, a secret liberation from the crushing weight of material sorrow. The next morning, Elias met with Mrs. Lysandra Vane, a widow of considerable wealth and influence who had heard of his discreet services. She was draped in her customary mourning silks, the heavy black fabric falling in perfect folds, her throat encircled tightly by the grief ribbon that symbolized her loss. "Mr. Elias," she said, her voice soft but resolute, "I require your skill. To hide my true grief beneath this facade and yet not be strangled by it." Elias bowed his head in understanding. "I have developed a technique," he explained, "to sever the ribbon without leaving any sign. It will feel as though you wear mourning, but the burden will be lifted." Mrs. Vane allowed him to measure and examine her garment, her pale fingers trembling. "If this brings freedom, I am willing to risk the consequences." Meanwhile, Constable Harrow prowled the fog-choked streets with growing suspicion. Reports of altered grief garments were increasing, and his investigations had uncovered subtle inconsistencies, seams that didn't match, ribbons that frayed in unexpected ways. He tightened his coat against the chill, his eyes scanning every mourner he passed. "This defiance will not be tolerated," he muttered, the badge on his chest gleaming coldly beneath the gaslight. Back in the workshop, Elias and Martha worked tirelessly, perfecting the delicate cuts and teaching trusted apprentices the technique. Each successful alteration was a victory, but with every one, the danger grew. The morning police intensified their patrols, and the network whispered of a looming crackdown. One evening, as the city settled into uneasy quiet, Elias sat alone, the weight of his actions pressing down heavier than any fabric. He traced the edge of a freshly severed ribbon, feeling the paradox, liberation born of risk, hope woven through fear. The ribbon's edge was a dangerous place to stand, but Elias knew he could not step back now. The seams of Victorian mourning were unraveling, and he held the scissors. As the chapter closes, the faint clip of boots echoes closer, signaling that the morning police are closing in. Elias's eyes narrow, resolve hardening. The air in the back room was thick with tension, heavier than the dense fog that clung to the gaslit streets outside. Elias stood at the center, the flickering candlelight casting his gaunt shadow against the peeling wallpaper, the room smelling faintly of damp wool and stale tobacco. Around him, the faces of his apprentices were drawn tight with fear and frustration. Mara's fingers trembled as she clenched a patchwork sleeve, her eyes darting like a startled bird's. "You ask too much," Jonah muttered, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. His voice was low but edged with sharpness. "The risks grow greater every day. We're exposed, Elias, and yet you push us further into the shadows." Lilius's gaze hardened but remained patient. "If we falter now, what have we fought for?" Mara's lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But at what cost? My brother was taken last week. They're closing in." The room fell into a suffocating stillness. Elias felt the sting of her words as if they were needles piercing through his resolve. He knew the dangers were real. Each new alteration, each secret meeting risked discovery by the morning police. Yet the alternative, surrendering to the suffocating rituals of grief, was a fate worse than any jail cell. "We cannot let fear dictate us," Elias said firmly, stepping forward so the candlelight caught the tired lines on his face. "Our cause is larger than any one of us. We must hold fast." But Mara's eyes flashed with something else, desperation or defiance, and she turned abruptly, the wooden floor creaking beneath her hurried steps. Before Elias could call her back, she was gone, swallowed by the night. The betrayal was a wound that cut deep. Elias knew that cracks in their unity could be exploited by Inspector Gray and his relentless agents. The morning police had tightened their noose, and now, more than ever, Elias's leadership would be tested. In the days that followed, whispers of suspicion curled through the group like smoke. Trust frayed as each member wondered who might betray them next. Elias worked tirelessly, patching holes not just in garments but in the fragile bonds holding his circle together. One evening, alone at his workbench, Elias traced the torn seam of a grief garment, the very fabric that symbolized the chains they sought to break. His hands shook, but his eyes burned with renewed determination. "If we cannot trust each other," he murmured, "then all is lost. But I will not let fear unravel us." Not yet. Beyond the hidden rooms and shadowed alleys, Inspector Gray watched with cold calculation. The outlaw tailor's network was weakening, but Elias was not yet caught. The game of cat and mouse intensified, the stakes higher than ever. Elias's world teetered on a knife's edge between hope and despair, loyalty and betrayal. The question remained, could he mend the tattered loyalties before the morning police tore them apart forever? As the fog rolled back over the city, cloaking secrets and sorrows alike, Elias prepared for the next move in a dangerous dance with fate, knowing that the future of their rebellion depended on the threads of trust he could still weave. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall swung open to reveal a scene that might have been lifted from the pages of a tragic play, each guest a player bound by the invisible script of mourning. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars overhead, their multifaceted prisms casting fractured light that danced and shimmered over the sea of black and violet gowns, the rustling silk and stiff collars of men whose faces were hidden behind delicate, somber masks. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax candles, mingled with the faintest hint of lavender and the whisper of crushed velvet. It was the annual mourner's mask, a ritual spectacle where grief was not just worn but performed. Each gesture and glance weighed down by the ceremonial pressure that gripped Victorian London. Elias moved through the crowd with cautious grace, his every step measured against the polished marble floor that echoed faintly beneath his boots. His own mask, a dark velvet covering edged with subtle silver embroidery, concealed the sharpness of his gaze. Around him, the elite clung to their costumes of sorrow, their mourning garments heavy with layers of silk, crepe, and jet beads, each stitch a testament to loss, yet also a chain binding them to societal expectation. He paused beside a marble fountain that burbled softly, its water catching the light like spilled glass. There, draped in a flowing gown of deep violet, stood Lady Maribel Stanton, her face hidden behind a black lace mask studded with jet beads that caught the candlelight. Her posture was regal, the weight of her sorrow palpable even through the delicate fabric. Elias inclined his head in greeting as she returned the gesture with a faint, knowing smile. "You honor us with your presence, Mr. Elias," she murmured, voice low enough to be lost beneath the swell of music and conversation. Few tailors dare to cross the threshold of such hallowed grief. He returned her smile with a flicker of defiance. "I come not as a mere tailor tonight, Lady Maribel, but as a messenger. There are those among us who long for a freedom beyond this performative sorrow." Her eyes, visible through the filigree of her mask, glimmered with a flicker of hope. "Then let us weave new patterns together." As the orchestra struck up a haunting waltz, Elias blended once more into the swirling crowd. His mind raced with the delicate balance he must maintain. Every word, every gesture, a calculated move in a dance far more dangerous than the one on the floor. Nearby, Captain Hargrave, the stern enforcer of mourning laws, prowled the edges of the ballroom. His black tailcoat bore the silver emblem of the mourning police, his mask plain but imposing, eyes sharp and alert. Elias felt the weight of the officer's gaze like a blade, a reminder of the ever-present threat that shadowed his every move. Among the guests, a young debutante named Miss Rosalind Gray caught Elias's eye. She was a fragile figure wrapped in a gown of mourning white, her mask edged with delicate black ribbons that contrasted starkly against her pale cheeks, flushed with the heat of the crowded room. Her wide eyes shone with innocent curiosity, a silent question hanging in the air. Could the rigid customs of grief ever bend to the yearning for emotional freedom? Elias approached her with a gentle bow. The dance is as much a mask as the one upon your face, Miss Gray, but sometimes even masks can slip. She blinked, a faint smile touching her lips, and for a moment, the heavy cloak of mourning seemed to lift. Throughout the evening, Elias wove through the glittering throng, planting quiet seeds of doubt and hope. He spoke in hushed tones to sympathetic ears, shared coded messages hidden in the subtlest of gestures, and observed the cracks beneath the veneer of public grief. Yet, with each step deeper into this world of shadow and sorrow, the danger grew sharper. Captain Hargrave's presence loomed like a storm cloud, and Elias knew that one misstep could unravel everything. As the night waned, the grand clock tower in the square outside chimed the late hour. The masked guests began to disperse, their grief garments rustling like dry leaves in the chill air. Elias lingered, his heart pounding with the thrill of defiance and the weight of the risks ahead. In the dim glow of a side corridor, Lady Maribel found him once more. "The fabric of society is woven with grief," she said softly. "But even the strongest cloth can be unraveled." Elias met her gaze, resolve hardening. "Then let us be the hands that unravel it, stitch by stitch." As he slipped away into the fog-laden streets of London, the masquerade of sorrow faded behind him, but the echoes of the night's whispered promises lingered. The mourner's mask was more than a ball. It was a battleground where the performance of grief met the spark of rebellion. And Elias, the Shadow Tailor, was determined to tear down the gilded cage that bound them all. But beneath the glitter and the masks, the question remained: could the delicate threads of hope withstand the tightening grip of the mourning police, or would the dance end with Elias unmasked and lost to the shadows forever? The night held its breath, waiting for the next move in this dangerous game of loss, love, and liberation. The air in the cellar was thick and close, shadows pooling in the corners next to splintered crates and stacks of folded, heavy mourning cloths. Elias crouched low by the flickering candle, his fingers deftly adjusting a seam on a garment designed to ease the weight of sorrow, without betraying the stern etiquette expected by the upper classes. Around him, his apprentices whispered urgently, their voices barely above the rustling of fabric. The secrets they carried were fragile threads woven beneath the surface of a city suffocated by grief and rigid custom. Tonight, the room's cramped cons were filled with a mixture of hope and dread. The underground network Elias had nurtured was growing, but so too were the eyes watching from the shadows. The mourning police, tireless and unforgiving, had stepped up their patrols and investigations. Rumors of arrests and public shaming had begun to circulate, chilling even the bravest hearts. A sudden, sharp clatter shattered the hushed atmosphere. The heavy wooden door to the cellar was flung open with a violent crash. Lantern light spilled into the room, casting stark illumination over faces frozen in shock and fear. Men in black uniforms stamped down the stairs, their boots echoing like thunder upon the worn stone. At their head was Inspector Mallory, his gaze razor-sharp, sweeping over the gathered rebels with chilling precision. By order of the Crown, he barked, voice hard as iron, "This assembly is hereby dissolved. Any resistance will be met with force." Panic erupted. Lydia seized a bundle of garments, clutching them to her chest as others scrambled for hidden exits. Elias's heart hammered fiercely. This raid was no accident, but a calculated strike to dismantle their fragile rebellion. Despite the chaos, Elias moved swiftly, guiding his apprentices toward a narrow passage concealed behind a stack of crates. But it was too late for some. Lydia was seized by two officers, her protests muffled as she was hauled toward the stairs. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, hers wide with fear, his filled with helpless sorrow. The raid was ruthless and effective. Garments were torn, journals containing Elias's coded methods confiscated, and many of his trusted allies were dragged away, their fates uncertain. The weight of betrayal pressed upon Elias's chest, the fraying edges of their cause unraveling before him. Days later, the public spectacle of punishment began. In the town square, mourners caught wearing altered grief garments were paraded before a jeering crowd. Their sorrow was no longer private, but a spectacle of shame. Elias watched from afar, the faces of those he cared for marked with humiliation, their dignity stripped alongside the modified fabrics. The movement that had promised liberation now seemed shackled by fear. But beneath the despair, a flicker of resolve burned in Elias's heart. The cost of their defiance was steep, but surrender was not an option. The threads of rebellion might be frayed, but they were not yet broken. As night fell over the gaslit streets, Elias stood alone beneath a wrought iron lamppost, the cold wind tugging at his coat. Somewhere in the distance, the mournful toll of a church bell echoed through the fog. He clenched his fists, knowing that the fight to unbind grief from its gilded cage was far from over. "They may have taken our friends," he whispered to the darkness, "but they will never take our hope." And with that, Elias melted into the shadows, the hunted tailor determined to stitch a new future from the tattered remnants of their cause. The chill of the London evening seeped through the narrow cracks of the chapel's ancient walls. But inside, a warmth kindled by shared conviction spread among the gathered few. Reverend Samuel Whitlock stood at the pulpit, his voice steady yet impassioned, weaving words that seemed to pierce the heavy fog of despair enveloping Victorian society. "We are called not to bear grief as a shackle, but to honor the departed with hearts unburdened by the cruelty of enforced display," he proclaimed, the stained glass windows casting kaleidoscopic hues upon his resolute face. Elias listened intently, his fingers clenched around the worn fabric of his coat. The Reverend's words were a balm to his weary spirit, a beacon cutting through the darkness that had shadowed his every step since he first dared to loosen the seams of sorrow. Here was a man who saw beyond the ritualistic cruelty that bound them all, a man who dared to challenge the divine sanction of grief garments. Outside the chapel, the city pulsed with its usual cacophony, but within the cramped confines of Clara Montague's studio, a different kind of noise erupted. Brushes scraped vigorously against canvas, paint splattered in wild arcs, and the scent of turpentine mingled with the faint trace of candle wax. Clara, her hands a riot of color and motion, was lost in the creation of a mural that dared to depict grief as a prison wrought from thread and fabric. Her eyes, sharp and bright, flicked momentarily to Elias as he entered, a rare smile touching her lips. "This is not just paint," she murmured, gesturing at the anguished faces and tangled chains forming on the wall. "It is a call to break free." Elias nodded, feeling the surge of renewed purpose. The movement that had begun in the shadows of his tiny workshop was now blossoming into a tapestry of resistance woven with voices from unexpected quarters, the clergy who preached mercy, the artists who wielded creativity as defiance. Yet the path was perilous. In the dim back room of a bustling tavern, Elias and Martha Gray huddled close, their whispered words slipping between the clamor of drunken laughter and the scrape of wooden stools. Martha's eyes darted nervously toward the doorway as she passed. Elias a folded piece of paper, a coded message detailing the next steps of their campaign. "The morning police have doubled their patrols," she warned softly, her voice taut with concern. "We must be cautious." "Caution is our ally," Elias replied, his tone steady though his heart raced. "But we cannot let fear unravel everything we've woven." Their conversation was a delicate dance of secrecy and hope, a microcosm of the larger struggle unfolding across London's grimy streets and gilded halls. It was in these moments, amid whispered plans and stolen glances, that the true strength of their cause emerged. The crescendo of their efforts culminated in a clandestine gathering beneath the flicker of candlelight, where clergy, artists, tailors, and mourners convened in a solemn pact. The room hummed with quiet determination as Reverend Whitlock, Clara Montague, Elias, and others laid out strategies to undermine the suffocating grip of grief garment laws. "We must reshape the narrative," Clara urged, "transform grief from a spectacle into a personal journey. And we must show that compassion is not weakness," the Reverend added, "but the very fabric of true mourning." Elias's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of those who had risked everything to stand here with him. Despite the looming threat of the mourning police and the weight of centuries of tradition, a fragile hope blossomed, a hope that perhaps together they could weave a new social fabric where grief was honored but no longer imposed. As the meeting dispersed into the London night, Elias lingered a moment longer, the chill now tempered by a fire kindled within. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but the threads of their rebellion were stronger than ever, intertwined with the courage and conviction of those who dared to dream of a future uncloaked in sorrow. The city might still wear its veil of grief, but beneath it, the weaving of hope had begun, quietly, fiercely, irrevocably. And as Elias stepped out into the fog, a whispered question lingered in the air. Could the stubborn fabric of Victorian mourning truly be unraveled? The answer would come, stitch by daring stitch, in the days to come. The low hum of the city beyond his workshop window was muffled by the thick fog that clung to the cobblestone streets of London, a persistent shroud that seemed to mirror the heavy weight of grief that draped over the populace like the very garments Elias sought to transform. In the flickering glow of a lone candle, Elias bent over his work table, fingers deftly weaving silver threads into the midnight black fabric that lay before him. This was no ordinary mourning dress. This was the liberation garment, a creation born from countless nights of whispered yearning and fierce defiance. Each stitch carried the hope of a future unshackled from the rigid expectations that had long dictated how sorrow must be worn and suffered. Elias's breath caught as he tied off the final seam, stepping back to survey the garment. Its design was both familiar and startlingly new. The customary veils and heavy layers were replaced by flowing fabrics that caught the light, embroidered with patterns of blooming flowers and rising flame, symbols of life and resilience. It was a silent rebellion sewn into cloth, a manifesto for mourners who wished to grieve on their own terms. The liberation garment was meant to be a beacon, a challenge to the cruel etiquette that had transformed grief into a public spectacle of oppression. That very evening, in a hidden room beneath the city's labyrinthine streets, Elias gathered his trusted circle. The room was thick with anticipation as Martha, his keen-eyed apprentice, carefully arranged the garment on a mannequin, the silver threads shimmering like stars in the dim light. Lady Arabella Whitcomb, the enigmatic aristocrat who had quietly pledged her support, sat with a measured grace, her gaze fixed on the garment as if seeing beyond its fabric into the promise it held. "It is unlike anything I have ever seen," murmured Martha, her voice a mixture of awe and tentative hope. "It does not weigh the bearer down, but lifts them." Elias nodded, feeling a rare smile touch his lips. Grief need not be a cage, nor a burden to display. It can be a quiet strength, a private flame that guides rather than consumes. This garment is our statement. The room fell into a hush as those assembled contemplated the significance of Elias's words. Whispers floated like fragile threads, weaving through the air, some filled with hope, others with fear. The mourning police had long hunted those who dared to defy the laws, and now Elias's defiance was more visible than ever. Later, as Elias stepped out into the chill of the London night, rain began to fall, cold and relentless. Beneath the gas lamps, a shadow detached itself from the mist Lady Arabella. Her eyes, dark and shining with unshed tears, met his. "You tread a perilous path," she said softly, voice trembling with a blend of fear and admiration. "But perhaps it is one we must walk. I will stand with you, Elias, not as a subject of sorrow, but as a bearer of hope." Their hands clasped briefly, an unspoken vow passing between them. Yet from the shadows, Inspector Hargrave watched, his gaze sharp and unforgiving. The city's machinery of control was shifting into motion, and Elias's act of rebellion would not go unanswered. As the liberation garment began to find its way onto the shoulders of those brave enough to wear it, debates ignited across parlors and alleys alike. To some, it was a betrayal of sacred tradition. To others, a breath of fresh air in a stifling world. The very fabric of Victorian mourning was unraveling, thread by delicate thread. Elias knew the risks that lay ahead. The mourning police would come with greater force, and the stakes would rise. Yet, in the quiet moments before dawn, as the city held its breath beneath the gray sky, he allowed himself a single thought of hope that the pattern he had broken might one day be woven anew into a tapestry where grief was a personal journey, not a public shackle. The night deepened, and with it the promise of change flickered like the candlelight, fragile yet unyielding. The night air was thick with mist, curling like ghostly fingers through the narrow alleys where Elias had once felt the faintest hope for his clandestine rebellion. Now that hope was unraveling like the torn seams of a hastily discarded garment. He stood in the shadows outside the door of his hidden workshop, heart pounding as the distant sound of boots echoed heavy, relentless, closing in like a tightening noose. Inside, Margot was arranging the last of the modified grief garments, her hands trembling as she adjusted a scene to grant more ease to a widow's burdened shoulders. Jonas was near her, his eyes scanning the dim room for any sign of danger, the flicker of a candle casting long shadows across his grim face. Suddenly, the door was shattered by a brutal crash. Wood splintered, and the rancid smell of smoke and wet leather filled the cramped space. The morning police poured in, led by the imposing figure of Inspector Harrow. His scarred face was set in a mask of merciless duty, his voice booming over the chaos. By order of the Crown, this place is under arrest for unlawful tampering with grief garments. Margot's eyes widened in shock, tears carving clean lines through the grime on her cheeks. "Elias!" she cried, but her voice was drowned in the clamor of boots and shouted commands. Hands grasped at her arms, dragging her away as she struggled, the soft rustle of her altered morning dress torn by the roughness of her captors. Elias was frozen for a heartbeat, the world spinning around him. Then, with desperate clarity, he ducked beneath a table piled with scraps of fabric and hidden journals. His breath came shallow and fast, each breath a stolen fragment of life as the police ransacked the room. Jonas fought fiercely but was quickly overwhelmed, his shouts silenced by the cold grip of shackles. The room grew still, but for the heavy steps and harsh whispers. Elias emerged only when the last officer had left, dragging Margot and Jonas into the foggy night. His heart ached, raw and ragged, torn between the urge to flee and the unbearable weight of loss. He sank to the floor, the worn wood cold beneath his knees. "I will find you," he whispered into the silence, no matter the cost. The raid was more than a violent interruption. It was a shattering of the fragile threads holding his movement together. The stolen garments, the coded journals, the secret patterns, all were now in the hands of his enemies. Elias knew the coming days would test every fiber of his being. But as the dawn crept over the city, painting the fog with pale gold, Elias rose. The pain was a heavy cloak, but it could not suffocate the fire within him. He slipped away into the bustling streets, a shadow among shadows, carrying the hope of those who still believed that grief need not be worn as a prison. His journey had become a torn tapestry of sacrifice and survival, each step forward stitched with the memory of those captured. Yet, even as the morning police tightened their grip, Elias's spirit remained unbroken, his resolve a needle threading through the darkness toward a new dawn. The question that haunted him was bitter but clear. How much could he sacrifice before the seams of his own soul gave way? And was the price of freedom worth the cost of those he loved? The city slept uneasily beneath the weight of enforced sorrow, but Elias Outlaw and Taylor wove a new pattern in the shadows, one that might someday unravel the tyranny of grief itself. As the fog swallowed his figure, the night whispered promises of defiance and hope, carrying his name like a secret stitch in the fabric of a changing world. And so the chapter closed, leaving the reader poised on the edge of uncertainty, eager to follow Elias's next desperate move in a world where every thread mattered. The underground chamber was cloaked in shadows, the faint flicker of a single candle casting trembling silhouettes on the cold stone walls. Elias sat hunched over a worn wooden table, his fingers tracing the delicate seams of a black garment, his own grief attire. The fabric was heavier than he remembered. Each stitch seemed to press down on his chest, bearing the weight of memories he had long tried to suppress. The silence around him was oppressive yet familiar, echoing the enforced quiet of mourning that society demanded. In the dim light, Elias let his mind wander back to the days when grief was a public spectacle, a chain woven tightly around the soul and displayed for all to see. He had once been a humble tailor, stitching these sorrowful garments with care, but beneath the surface, a quiet rebellion had taken root. Now, as an outlaw of emotion, his solitude was both a refuge and a prison. His thoughts drifted to Martha, his most trusted apprentice and companion in this clandestine fight. She had arrived quietly earlier, wrapping herself in a muted shawl that barely concealed the faint marks of grief she too had worn. Their whispered conversations in this hidden sanctuary were lifelines, plans sewn together with hope and caution. Together they plotted the next steps to unravel the suffocating customs that bound their city in sorrow. Elias's fingers moved deftly, loosening a seam here, smoothing a fold there as he spoke softly. "We must be careful, Martha. Each alteration is a thread pulled from the fabric of this cruel tradition. But if we unravel too quickly, they will come for us all." Martha nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. The city is restless. Even the clergy and artists are beginning to question the weight we bear. Our time is coming, Elias. As night deepened, Elias's mind wandered into dreams, a labyrinth of faces both familiar and lost. He saw the widow relieved by his secret modifications, the aristocrat who dared to hide true sorrow beneath gilded layers, and the apprentices who risked everything to join his cause. Their silent expressions were stitched into the tapestry of his resolve, a reminder that his fight was not just against fabric, but against the very silence imposed upon grief. The muffled sounds of Victorian London filtered down from above the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones, hurried footsteps echoing in alleys, and the distant tolling of church bells marking time and loss. These sounds were the pulse of a city bound by ritual, yet Elias heard in them the stirrings of change. Loneliness was his constant companion, yet it was tempered by a burgeoning courage that set his heart aflame. The silence he endured was no longer a shackle, but a forge, tempering his spirit for the battles ahead. In this quiet crucible, Elias vowed to transform his sorrow into strength, to weave defiance into every stitch, and to one day see a world where grief was felt deeply, but never worn as a chain. Yet even as hope stirred, a shadow lingered, a reminder that the path forward was fraught with peril. The morning police were relentless, and trust was a fragile thread easily snapped. Elias knew that the silent seam he now wove between sorrow and rebellion might be his last, but he embraced it with unwavering resolve. In the depths of the night, as the candle guttered low, Elias's whispered vow filled the chamber. "I will not let grief be our prison. We will find freedom in feeling, not in wearing." And with that, the silent seam of his rebellion was stitched tighter, ready to unravel the gilded grief that bound Victorian London. I sat alone in the cluttered sanctuary of my workshop, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows upon the walls, lined with bolts of fabric and worn tailoring tools. Each stitch I placed in the garment before me was deliberate, a silent defiance woven thread by thread into the very fabric of tradition. This was no ordinary grief garment. It was to be the last and emblem of liberation disguised beneath the guise of mourning, a cloak that would not suffocate but instead breathe with the wearer. Marianne's footsteps echoed softly from the back room, her presence a steady comfort amid the chaos of my thoughts. She appeared at the doorway, eyes bright with the same fierce hope that had propelled us through countless dangers. "It looks unlike any garment I've seen," she whispered, stepping closer to examine the delicate embroidery that shimmered faintly, like tears turned to light. "It must," I replied, hands steady despite the pounding in my chest. "If this fails, we risk everything. But if it succeeds, it will unravel the chains that bind us all." Our plan was audacious to bold, perhaps, but necessity had long since silenced caution. The city's suffocating customs demanded that grief be worn as tangible proof of loss, a spectacle that crushed the spirit beneath layers of black silk and stifling lace. I had spent years in secret rebellion, loosening seams and softening linings, but this, the final stitch, would challenge the very foundation of that oppression. Lady Beatrice arrived under the cloak of twilight, her usual regal composure tempered by a rare vulnerability. In the quiet confines of my workshop, she shed the elaborate sorrow that society demanded of her, revealing a woman weary of pretense yet burning with quiet resolve. "The hour draws near," she murmured, her voice a fragile thread connecting us all. "The world may not be ready, but neither are we to remain silent." Together we mapped the course of our rebellion, a grand public ceremony where the garment would be unveiled, not as a symbol of mourning, but of mourning unbound. It was a gamble against the rigid structures enforced by the mourning police, led by the relentless Inspector Harrow, whose shadow loomed over every whispered conversation and furtive glance. Days bled into nights as preparations consumed us. Each secret meeting, each whispered exchange, carried the weight of potential betrayal. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. The usual clatter of carriages and chatter dulled beneath the oppressive fog that mirrored the heaviness in our hearts. On the eve of our plan, I found myself alone on the rain-slicked streets, the cold biting through my threadbare coat. The tolling church bells marked the passing hours, their somber cadence a reminder of the stakes we faced. Around me, the grief garments of the city's mourners swayed like a dark tide, a sea of sorrow waiting to be challenged. Would the world see the garment as I intended, a sign of hope, of freedom, or would it brand me as a heretic, a criminal against the sacred rites of mourning? The question gnawed at me, but beneath it all burned a resolute flame. No longer could sorrow be dictated by fabric and ceremony. It must be felt, lived, and ultimately freed. As dawn crept over the horizon, I traced the final stitch with a trembling finger and whispered a vow to the silent city. This was the last garment I would ever sew in the name of grief. The rest would be woven from courage, defiance, and the unyielding desire for a world unshackled by the weight of material sorrow. The stage was set, the hour was upon us. With a steady breath, I prepared to face the consequences of the last stitch. The following hours were a whirlwind of whispered commands and hurried movements. Marianne moved like a shadow by my side, steadying my nerves with a reassuring squeeze of the arm. Lady Beatrice's influence opened doors otherwise barred, granting us access to the grand hall where the ceremony was to take place, a spectacle of opulence and somber tradition that masked the undercurrents of unrest. The crowd gathered, draped in the customary veils of mourning, their faces a mix of resignation and curiosity. As the appointed moment arrived, I stepped forward, cloaked in the garment I had crafted, its dark surface catching the light and shimmering with the subtle embroidery that told a story of resilience. Gasps rippled through the assembly as the fabric caught their eyes, not a symbol of oppression, but a mantle of liberation. Whispers grew louder, eyes met with new understanding, and the rigid lines of ceremony began to blur. Yet from the shadows I could sense the tightening grip of Inspector Harrow and his men, their presence a stark reminder of the dangers we courted. The final stitch had been placed, but the unraveling had only just begun. As the ceremony descended into chaos, I locked eyes with Marianne and Lady Beatrice, a silent pledge passing between us. No matter the outcome, this was a beginning. The last stitch was not an end, but the first thread in a tapestry of change. And so, beneath the gaslit lamps of Victorian London, the fabric of grief began to tear thread by fragile thread into something new, something unbound. The city held its breath, and I waited for the dawn. The city was cloaked in a thick, unyielding fog as dawn broke over Victorian London, the pallid light scarcely penetrating the suffocating gloom. From his vantage upon a narrow balcony that overlooked the bustling thoroughfare beneath, Elias felt the weight of countless eyes upon him, some curious, others fearful, many desperate. The crowd had gathered in numbers that defied expectation: shopkeepers, laborers, aristocrats hidden beneath their veils, and children with wide, uncertain eyes. All had come to witness the unraveling of a tradition that had bound them in invisible chains for generations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elias began, his voice carrying over the murmurs like a thread of steel forged in the fires of conviction. "For too long we have worn our grief as a shackle, our sorrow sewn into every seam, every fold, as if it were the only truth we possess. Today, I offer you a choice of hope that grief need not be a garment that weighs upon us, but a feeling that lives within, free and unbound." Beneath him, assistants carefully unveiled the first array of modified grief garments. Their appearance was unremarkable at a glance: black silks, fine lace, the customary adornments of mourning. Yet their seams had been undone, their linings removed, their constrictions eased. The physical burdens that had once stifled breath and bent backs were gone, replaced by a lighter fabric and an even lighter spirit. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. A widow clutched her altered shawl, tears mingling with a tentative smile. A merchant removed his heavy gloves, flexing fingers that had been numb with sorrow and societal expectation. The murmuring grew louder, swelling into voices that dared to hope. But such hope did not go unnoticed by the enforcers of tradition. From the shadowed edges of the square, Inspector Hargrave observed with a cold, calculating gaze. Clad in the austere uniform of the morning police, his presence was a stark reminder of the rigid order that governed the city's grief. "Begin the arrests," he commanded, voice low but ironclad. "These acts are seditious. Let no one forget the cost of defiance." The officers moved swiftly, their boots striking cobblestones with a harsh rhythm that echoed through the misty streets. Men and women adorned in Elise's modified garments were seized, protests crushed beneath the weight of authority. The clash between old and new, between oppression and liberation, ignited a fever that spread through the city like wildfire. In a dimly lit parlor far from the turmoil, Lady Marian Ashcroft convened a discreet assembly. Draped in elegant mourning attire that concealed her sharp gaze, she addressed a circle of influential figures. "We cannot deny the truth any longer," she intoned. "The customs that bind us in sorrow also bind us in silence and submission. It is time to question the rituals that have governed our lives and to find a path toward healing that honors loss without demanding chains." Her words kindled a cautious flame of resolve among those present, a quiet but growing force that challenged the very foundations of Victorian society. Meanwhile, Elias retreated to the sanctuary of his workshop, a sanctuary now marred by chaos. Torn fabrics littered the floor, remnants of hurried preparations and shattered hopes. His body bore the marks of recent skirmishes, bruises darkening beneath his sleeves, a cut on his cheek stinging with every breath. Yet, within his eyes burned a steadfast light, a testament to unyielding spirit. As the city writhed in unrest, the morning police tightened their grip, but the tide had begun to turn. The public's whispered sympathies now emerged as murmurs of support, and the once unassailable edifice of enforced grief began to show cracks. Elias knew the road ahead was fraught with peril. Tradition, like the heavy fabric of the grief garments he had spent his life altering, was woven with threads strong and enduring. Yet every thread, he believed, could be pulled, every seam undone, until the garment of sorrow was no longer a prison but a cloak of remembrance and freedom. And so, as night fell over London, the city held its breath, between the tightening grasp of the morning police and the fragile, burgeoning hope kindled by a tailor who dared to dream of a world uncloaked in grief. "This is but the beginning," Elias whispered to the shadows. "The stitches that bind us will come undone, one by one." Outside, distant bells tolled mournfully, their echoes carrying through the fog. But amidst the tolling, a new sound began to rise, a chorus of voices, rising, weaving a new pattern into the fabric of society. The unraveling had begun. The night air was sharp and biting as Elias moved swiftly through the labyrinthine alleys of Victorian London, his breath misting in the chill. Each step echoed faintly against the cobblestones, a hurried rhythm against the silence that had settled over the city like a shroud. The rebellion, the clandestine network he had nurtured so carefully, was unraveling faster than he had feared. Whispers of betrayal had reached him in recent days, but he had hoped against hope that the roots of treachery lay elsewhere. He rounded a corner near a narrow passageway, heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and dread. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, stepping forward with a nervous glance over his shoulder. "Elias," the figure whispered, voice tight with urgency. "They're coming for you." Recognition hit him like a blow. Thomas Gray, once his most trusted apprentice, now a trembling harbinger of doom. Elias's eyes narrowed. "Why?" he asked, voice low but steady. Thomas swallowed hard, avoiding the piercing gaze. "They promised leniency. They said if I helped, I'd be spared the worst." Before Elias could respond, the clatter of boots erupted from the shadows. Morning police officers, led by the formidable Inspector Mallory, surged into the alleyway, their dark uniforms stark against the dim gaslight. Elias's heart sank, the betrayal cutting deeper than any blade. Hands gripped his arms with iron strength. The cold snap of shackles closing around his wrists was a cruel punctuation to the night's events. As he was dragged through the streets, the familiar cityscape now seemed hostile and alien. Faces that once nodded in secret solidarity now averted their eyes, fearful of association. Thrown into a dank, cramped prison cell, Elias's world contracted to the cold stone walls and the faint, flickering glow of a single candle. The air was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of damp and despair. Night after night, the silence pressed in on him, broken only by the distant clatter of footsteps and the muffled voices of guards exchanging terse words. His mind became a battleground. Memories of his cause, the tapestry of stolen moments with his allies, and the sharp sting of Thomas's betrayal wove together into a torment that threatened to unravel his very being. The grief garment he once crafted so skillfully now felt like a shackle around his soul. Yet, amid the isolation, there were moments of fierce clarity. Elias recalled the faces of those he sought to free: the widows, the oppressed, the silent mourners stifled by society's demands. Their sorrow was no longer just a burden of fabric and thread, but a tangible weight upon his conscience. One evening, as the candle guttered and shadows danced erratically on the cell walls, Elias heard footsteps approach. The cell door creaked open and a guard stepped in, his voice gruff yet not unkind. "Word is, you're a hard man to break." Elias met the guard's gaze steadily. "Breaking is not the same as bending." The guard nodded, a flicker of respect passing between them before the door shut once more, leaving Elias alone in the darkness. In the days that followed, Elias's thoughts turned inward, weaving resolve from the threads of despair. The betrayal that had shattered his trust also illuminated the depths of his conviction. If his capture was a loose thread in the grand fabric of his rebellion, then he would unravel it from within, turning confinement into a crucible of transformation. Through whispered conversations with fellow prisoners and subtle observations of the guards, Elias began to gather intelligence. His mind sharpened, plotting not just survival but the continuation of his cause beyond the walls that imprisoned him. The physical chains could bind his body, but his spirit sought freedom in the quiet spaces of hope and defiance. And as dawn's pale light seeped through the barred window, casting cold rays across the worn floor, Elias stared outward, a flicker of hope igniting within. The city was vast, and his story, though momentarily bound, was far from over. The loose thread of his capture might yet unravel the entire tapestry of Victorian mourning. With that fragile hope, he prepared for what lay ahead, knowing that even in darkness, the smallest light could kindle a revolution. The heavy bars of the prison cell cast long shadows across the cold stone floor as Elias settled onto the narrow cot, the weight of captivity pressing down upon him like the very garments of grief he once sought to undo. Yet, despite the harshness of his surroundings, a flicker of something unexpected stirred within him hope. Father Ambrose, the prison chaplain, had become an unlikely beacon in this bleak place. Each day, as the sun crept timidly through the small barred window, Elias awaited the soft footsteps and the rustle of the worn robes that heralded the elderly man's arrival. Their conversations, whispered and furtive, wove a tapestry of trust and shared conviction. The chaplain spoke not in sermons, but in gentle encouragements, revealing a deep sympathy for Elias's cause and a desire to see the heavy chains of mourning customs broken. "There is power in what you do, Elias," Father Ambrose murmured one afternoon, his voice a hushed comfort amid the clanging echoes of the prison. "Even behind these walls, your threads of change are not severed." Elias nodded, the coarse fabric of his prison garb a stark reminder of the garments he once crafted and now sought to dismantle in spirit. Beside him, Mara, a fellow inmate who had once plied her trade as a seamstress, became a steadfast companion. Their shared histories of needle and thread became a lifeline, a whispered rebellion against the dehumanizing weight of their confinement. In the chill of the prison yard, their voices mingled with the clatter of iron and the murmurs of other inmates. They exchanged stories, lessons, and dreams, each stitch of conversation a small act of resistance. Mara's fierce gaze met Elias's with understanding. Here, even in chains, their craft held a quiet dignity. Meanwhile, beyond the grim walls that caged Elias's body, the world was shifting. Lillian Hawke, a woman of sharp intellect and passionate resolve, rallied artists, clergy, and common folk alike. In smoky rooms and candlelit galleries, she spoke of the cruelty embedded in Victorian mourning, how grief had been twisted into a spectacle, a prison of cloth and ceremony that suffocated the soul. Her words ignited a fire among those weary of enforced sorrow. Paint-streaked fingers clutched pamphlets. Hymns were rewritten to honor healing instead of despair. The movement grew, its heartbeat echoing faintly within the prison where Elias lay captive. One evening, as the prison settled into uneasy silence, a guard approached Elias's cell, slipping a crumpled letter through the bars with deft fingers. The message was brief but potent. The movement was gaining momentum. Voices once silenced now spoke boldly. Elias's spirit lifted, the news a balm against the cold and isolation. The walls that confined his body could not bind his influence. Through alliances forged in shadows and whispers, through the courage of those outside who dared to dream of change, Elias's vision endured. The threads of redemption were weaving a new pattern, one of hope, resilience, and the promise of a future where grief might be felt deeply but no longer worn as a shackle. As Elias traced the lines of the letter with trembling fingers, he knew the fight was far from over. Yet, in this crucible of hardship, the seed of transformation had taken root. And with it, the dawn of a new morning was beginning to break. The prison's cold walls echoed with the soft scratch of needle on fabric, the whispered hope of redemption woven stitch by stitch. Elias's journey, though shackled, was far from finished. End of. The air in the town hall was thick with anticipation, the faint scent of beeswax from countless gas lamps mingling with the murmurs of a crowd on the cusp of change. Lady Marian Ashcroft stood poised at the lectern, her silken gown a softened echo of morning black, its fabric flowing without the weight that once defined grief in the eyes of society. Her voice, steady and clear, rose above the subdued clamor, weaving a tapestry of words that challenged the very foundation of their customs. "We have long worn our sorrow as armor," she began, a garb so heavy it suffocates the spirit it seeks to honor. But what if grief, instead of being a burden, could be a quiet companion, a memory cherished, not a prison imposed? The crowd shifted, some faces creased with skepticism, others alight with a tentative hope. Elias, standing near the back, felt the familiar tug of his own journey, the countless nights stitching and unpicking the bonds of sorrow sewn into fabric. His eyes traced the faces before him, from the hardened shopkeepers to the curious aristocrats, all caught in the throes of a society slowly unraveling. Margaret, his former apprentice, had taken to the streets with a burgeoning collection of grief garments, reimagined lighter fabrics, muted designs that honored loss without enslavement. Passers-by paused, fingers brushing the delicate weaves, their expressions a mixture of surprise and relief. For the first time in decades, mourning felt less like a public spectacle and more like a personal passage. Reverend Thomas Halley, seated near the front, nodded approvingly. His sermons had begun to echo this sentiment, urging compassion and inner reflection over outward display. In the quiet moments of his church, with the hearth fire crackling softly, he preached of grief as a natural tide to be felt, not a costume to be worn. Yet the path was far from smooth. Critics whispered of decay in morals, of disrespect to the dead. The morning police, though less vigilant now, still cast wary eyes on any deviation. Elias knew the struggle ahead was not merely against fabric and thread, but against centuries of ingrained belief. But tonight, as Lady Marian's words lingered in the air, as Margaret's garments caught the eye of a hesitant noblewoman, and as Reverend Hale's gentle call to empathy found fertile ground, the first true stitches of change had been sown. Elias stepped forward when the meeting concluded, greeted by nods and quiet thanks. His heart, once burdened by the weight of grief garments, now carried a lighter hope. The morning unbound was no longer a distant dream, but a dawning reality. Outside, the fog of London seemed less oppressive, the gas lamps flickering with renewed warmth. The city held its breath, poised between the old and the new, as the fabric of society began to shift beneath its feet. And in that shifting weave, Elias saw the promise of a future where sorrow could be felt deeply, yet freely, no longer a garment to wear, but a memory to hold close. But as the night deepened, a lingering question remained. Could a society so rooted in ceremony and spectacle truly embrace a mourning unbound? Or would the old threads of tradition pull tight once more, suffocating the fragile hope newly born? The answer, Elias knew, would be stitched with every step they took forward. The heavy iron gates groaned open, a sound Elias had imagined countless times during his confinement. But nothing had prepared him for the sharp chill of the London air. mingled with the distant cries of street vendors and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages. As he stepped beyond the prison threshold, the familiar fog was pierced by streaks of reluctant sunlight, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward a future uncertain yet promising. Faces emerged in the crowd, some weathered by hardship, others softened by hope. Marguerite was among the first to reach his side, her eyes a balm of quiet strength. "Welcome back, Elias," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The years of struggle, sacrifice, and solitude had etched themselves into his frame, but in that moment the weight seemed to lift just enough to breathe. The city had changed. The once rigid and suffocating grief garments now bore signs of transformation, simpler cuts, lighter fabrics, and subtle embellishments that spoke not of despair, but of remembrance and resilience. Children darted through the streets, their laughter unburdened by the heavy folds that previously marked sorrow as a public shackle. Elias's thoughts drifted to those lost along the way, the apprentices betrayed, the friends imprisoned, the countless souls who had borne grief both visible and invisible. Yet, amidst the ruins of the past, a fragile hope had taken root. That evening, in the dim warmth of a back room tucked away from prying eyes, Elias and Marguerite pored over letters and sketches. "The garments must honor grief without imprisoning it," she said, tracing a pattern with a careful finger. "Your vision has sparked something more than rebellion. It has opened hearts." Their whispered plans wove together strands of healing and defiance, a tapestry to cloak the future. Days later, Leilas found himself within the ornate walls of Sir Alistair Fenton's estate. The grandeur of the room was a stark contrast to the humble workshop he once called home. Yet beneath the velvet and crystal he perceived a shared sorrow, a gilded cage housing unspoken losses. Sir Alistair's candid words revealed a man torn between privilege and the weight of expectation. "Change is inevitable, Elias," he admitted, "but the true test lies in how society embraces it." Walking the familiar streets, Elias observed the shifting landscape of mourning. The city breathed with tentative freedom, its people learning to wear grief not as armor, but as a quiet emblem of love and memory. The journey ahead remained fraught with challenges, but for the first time in many years, the path seemed illuminated by more than mere shadows. As twilight settled, Elias paused beneath a gas lamp's glow, the light flickering like the fragile flame of hope within him. The legacy of a tailor who dared to unravel the threads of sorrow was no longer confined to whispered tales. It was woven into the very fabric of London's soul, awaiting the next chapter to be stitched with courage and compassion. The road forward was uncertain, but Elias knew that grief, unshackled and unadorned, could finally be felt in its purest form, not worn, but lived. And so, as the city exhaled the breath of a new dawn, the tailor who had once been an outlaw of emotion stepped quietly into the legacy he had wrought, one stitch, one soul, one hope at a time. The morning light crept softly through the tall, arched windows of the new workshop, washing the modest room in a gentle glow that Elias had not seen in many years. The scent of fresh linen and lavender subtly mingled with the faintest trace of ink and wool, stirring a quiet sense of promise within him. He stood at the threshold, fingers tracing the worn brass handle of the door, a symbol of a new beginning forged from years of hardship and clandestine defiance. The workshop was unlike the cramped, shadowed backrooms of his past, where secrets were whispered between threads and needles. Here, the air was lighter, the space open, with shelves neatly lined with bolts of fabric in hues soft and inviting rather than somber and oppressive. Pale blues, gentle grays, and muted greens replaced the heavy blacks and deep purples that once dominated the morning attire of Victorian London. Martha was already at work, her nimble fingers threading a needle with precision. She glanced up, offering Elias a quick smile, the kind that spoke of shared purpose and unspoken understanding. "I've begun stitching the first of the new designs," she said quietly, her voice steady but infused with a tender excitement. "They're soft, flexible, easier to wear, kinder to the skin." Elias nodded, moving toward a work table where a sketchbook lay open, pages filled with delicate embroidery patterns inspired by nature's quiet resilience, willows bending in the wind. blooming forget-me-nots and intertwined ribbons symbolizing connection rather than confinement. Each design was a deliberate rejection of the rigid, suffocating customs that had long dictated the city's approach to grief. Later, Reverend Alden arrived, his presence both reassuring and invigorating. The clergyman's eyes held the wisdom of years spent counseling the bereaved, and yet they sparkled with the possibility of change. "Elias," he said, folding his hands respectfully, "your vision honors the sorrow of loss without chaining the soul. This is a path toward healing many have long yearned for but dared not speak aloud." They spoke at length about the evolving role of mourning in society, how grief need not be a spectacle of suffering but could instead become a private, dignified process supported by garments that comfort rather than constrain. Reverend Alden's support was a beacon, signaling that even the pillars of tradition might bend toward compassion. The first clients arrived in the afternoon, a small, cautious group who represented a cross-section of the city's mourners seeking relief from the heavy expectations of their social station. Among them was Mrs. Latham, a widow whose dignified grace had been dimmed by years of wearing the traditional garments that seemed to weigh down not just the body, but the spirit. As they tried on the new garments, a remarkable transformation occurred. Laughter, soft and genuine, broke the usual solemnity. The fabrics felt like a gentle embrace, allowing movement and breath where once there had been rigidity and suffocation. The embroidery whispered stories of resilience, memory, and hope, weaving a new narrative where grief was acknowledged but not imprisoned. Elias observed quietly, the corners of his mouth lifting into a rare smile. This was the moment he had fought for, a reshaping of sorrow that honored the past without being shackled by it. As twilight descended, Elias gathered his small assembly for a modest unveiling. Before them lay a garment unlike any other, light as a whisper, embroidered with symbols of endurance and healing, its colors a soft harmony of blues and grays that seemed to pulse with quiet strength. He spoke with steady conviction. This is not merely clothing but a new language of mourning. A language that allows sorrow to be felt, remembered, and ultimately transformed. Let us step forward from the shadows of enforced grief into the light of compassionate remembrance. The room was silent for a moment, then filled with murmurs of approval and hope. Elias's heart swelled with the knowledge that this was only the beginning, that the threads he wove today might one day reshape the sorrow of an entire city. Yet, as the last light faded from the sky, a single question lingered in Elias's mind. Could this fragile new fabric of mourning truly withstand the weight of tradition, or would it unravel beneath the pressures of a society still bound by its old grief? With hands steady and spirit undimmed, Elias prepared for the journey ahead, knowing that every stitch he made was a step toward freedom for himself, and for all who dared to mourn without chains. The dawn cast a pale light over the narrow streets of London, filtering softly through the stained glass windows of Elias's new workshop. It was a modest space, yet filled with quiet energy, the hum of sewing machines, the rustle of fabric, and the soft murmur of voices sharing stories and hopes. Here, grief was no longer a heavy shackle, but a cloth to be shaped and reshaped. A living garment that could bend, breathe, and evolve with the wearer. Miriam sat by the window, her fingers deftly guiding a length of midnight blue silk through the needle. The fabric was light, almost ethereal, embroidered delicately with silver threads that caught the morning light like faint stars. "This," she said softly, "will move with her, not against her." No corsets, no crushing layers, just the memory of loss, held gently. Elias nodded, his eyes tracing the patterns. Exactly, mourning should not be imprisonment but a companion. One that walks beside you, not behind iron bars of expectation. Outside, the city was stirring. Word of Elias's work had crossed the river and the hills, reaching ears in distant towns and villages. One such place was a bustling coastal market where Sanjay, a merchant with a keen eye for both tradition and change, prepared to introduce his own adaptation of Elias's mourning garments. The market was a kaleidoscope of colors and voices, fishermen bartering, children chasing one another, women displaying vibrant textiles. Among them, Sanjay stood proudly beside a stand draped in fabrics both somber and bright, blending the local customs with the subtle innovations championed by Elias. Mourning cloaks woven with flax and dyed in, Shades of ocean blue, scarves embroidered with motifs of waves and renewal, hats trimmed with feathers symbolizing flight from sorrow. As the crowd gathered, murmurs of curiosity and admiration rippled through the air. Sanjay addressed them with warmth. "We honor our losses not by weight but by the stories our garments tell. Through these threads, grief becomes a part of our lives, not a chain." Back in London, Lydia prepared for an event that promised to be a turning point. The gallery was alive with anticipation, the air thick with the scent of oil paints and fresh paper. Lydia, ever the fierce spirit, stood before a large mural that dominated the wall, a sweeping canvas where shadow and light intertwined, sorrow blossoming into vibrant hues of renewal. The crowd was hushed as the curtain fell away, revealing the image of a figure shedding a cloak of dark fabric, stepping into a garden awash with blossoms. The mural spoke without words, capturing the essence of Elias's vision. Grief was not a prison but a passage. Eyes glistened with tears and hope. Whispers of freedom and new beginnings wove through the room like a gentle breeze. Meanwhile, in the quiet sanctuary of a small chapel, Father Ambrose led a service unlike any other. The mourners wore garments unlike the rigid black that once dominated their appearances. Instead, soft grays, deep blues, and muted purples swayed with their movements, embroidered with symbols of memory and hope. The priest's voice was calm, carrying a prayer for those who grieved and for those who sought release. "May we remember without being bound, mourn without being silenced, and live with the weight of sorrow lightened by love." Elias watched the gathering through a window, a gentle smile touching his lips. His journey had taken him far beyond the cramped backroom where he first loosened a seam in secret. Now his vision was a tide rolling across the land, reshaping the contours of mourning itself. Yet, even amid this blossoming change, he felt the lingering pull of the old world, the ceremonies steeped in rigid tradition, the police who still chased shadows of defiance, the whispered fears of those clinging to familiar grief. But for the first time in many years, Elias believed the cloth of sorrow could be rewoven into something new, a tapestry that held space for freedom, for expression, for healing. As evening fell, the city's lamplighters began their rounds, casting pools of golden light on cobblestones slick with recent rain. Elias returned to his workbench, fingers steady and heart resolute. Tomorrow would bring more stitches, more stories, and more souls ready to embrace a new kind of mourning. The new cloth was being woven, thread by thread, heart by heart. And with it a future where grief was felt deeply but worn lightly. But the question lingered, like a whisper in the night, how far would the old powers go to unravel this fragile fabric of change? Elias knew the journey was far from over. Yet, in the steady rhythm of needle and thread, hope was sown anew. And so, beneath the flickering gaslight, the tailor of sorrow prepared to face whatever dawn might bring, armed not with weapons, but with the transformative power of the new cloth. The gas lamps flickered softly along the cobbled square, casting a pale glow over the assembled crowd. A mist hovered low, weaving through the gathered bodies like a whispered secret. Elias stood at the center, atop a wooden platform hastily constructed for this singular occasion. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat echoing the weight of the moment. Before him, a heavy velvet curtain hung, concealing the garment that he had poured his soul into crafting, a symbol not just of clothing, but of a new era in mourning. Around him, the murmur of voices ebbed and flowed. Many faces were veiled with skepticism, some with curiosity, and a few with genuine hope. The years of hardship, of clandestine stitches and whispered trades, had led to this fragile public unveiling. Elias's gaze swept over the crowd and landed briefly on Lady Miriam Ashcombe, her pale face serene yet charged with emotion. She gave him a subtle nod and unspoken encouragement that steadied him. Clearing his throat, Elias stepped forward, the wooden boards creaking beneath his worn boots. "Good people of London," he began, his voice steady, though laced with the tremors of passion. "We have long borne the heavy mantle of grief, not only in our hearts, but upon our backs. Today I present not a garment of sorrow, but a cloak of hope, a testament that mourning need not bind, but may also free." A hush settled over the crowd, the weight of his words pressing upon them. Inspector Graves stood at the edge of the assembly, his usual stern demeanor slightly softened, eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in contemplation. The morning police had long enforced the strict codes of grief attire, policing the outward expressions of inward pain. Elise's act was a direct challenge to their authority, a bold defiance that risked everything. With deliberate care, Elias grasped the curtain's edge and pulled. The fabric fell away to reveal a garment unlike any seen before, a resplendent piece woven from black silk interlaced with delicate threads of gold and silver that caught the lamplight like stars caught in night's embrace. The bodice bore intricate embroidery of blooming layla and soaring phoenixes, their forms entwined in a dance of renewal. It shimmered with a quiet radiance, embodying not just the pain of loss but the promise of rebirth. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some eyes widened in disbelief. Others glistened with unshed tears. Mrs. Adelaide Finch, standing near the front, brushed a trembling hand across her lips, a fragile smile breaking through her grief. She had been one of Elias's earliest clients, her own mourning garment transformed by his subtle alterations into something lighter, something bearable. Elias continued, his voice gathering strength. This is the Phoenix Veil, a garment that honors the depth of sorrow while embracing the possibility of healing. It is for those who mourn not to chain them in endless despair, but to remind them that from ashes, life can rise anew. A ripple of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing with fervor. Lady Miriam stepped forward, her voice clear and steady as she added, "For too long, our society has dictated the outward signs of grief, shackling the soul to rigid customs. Today, we witness the birth of a new understanding where mourning is a personal journey, not a public performance." Inspector Graves's gaze remained fixed on Elias, the lines of his face betraying a complexity of thought. Though bound by duty, he could not deny the stirring in his chest, the recognition that perhaps the old ways were due for change. He inclined his head in a silent, grudging respect. As the ceremony drew to a close, Elias felt the weight of countless eyes upon him, not with suspicion or scorn, but with a dawning respect. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with resistance and the ghosts of tradition, yet in this moment a seed of transformation had been sown. He stepped down from the platform, the crowd parting before him like a tide shifting in motion. Whispers of hope and questions of possibility swirled around him, mingling with the crisp night air. The final fitting had been made, not just of cloth, but of a future where grief might be worn with dignity or perhaps not worn at all. And as Elias disappeared into the misty streets, the faintest smile touched his lips, for he knew this was but the beginning of a revolution stitched in threads of courage and compassion. The city held its breath, poised on the edge of change. The chill of dawn crept quietly over the rooftops of London, painting the city in soft, muted hues that whispered of change. I found myself alone atop the familiar heights overlooking the tangled streets and chimneys, a sprawling sea of sorrow and hope intertwined. The fog, once a thick shroud obscuring every corner, was lifting now, revealing the first tentative brushstrokes of light. It was a fragile dawn, much like the fragile promise that had carried me through these long years. I breathed deeply, the crisp morning air filling my lungs, carrying with it the sense of damp stone and distant hearth fires. Below me, the city stirred, some still cloaked in the heavy fabrics of enforced mourning, others daring to shed those bindings, stepping into a new world where grief might be felt but no longer worn as a chain. This was the world I had fought for, the world I still struggled to shape. In the years past, I had been but a simple tailor, stitching the garments of sorrow for those bound by society's stern dictates. Yet beneath the measured hems and black silks, I had nurtured a quiet rebellion, a yearning for liberation, not just of fabric, but of spirit. The journey had been perilous, marked by betrayal, loss, and the relentless gaze of those who sought to maintain the status quo. But through the shadows, a movement had grown, born on whispered hopes and clandestine stitches. Today marked the culmination of that journey. Descending from the rooftop, I entered the workshop that Marianne and I had transformed from a cramped backroom into a sanctuary of healing. The space was alive with the gentle hum of creation, the soft rustle of silks, the faint scrape of needles against fabric, the murmur of shared purpose. The air was tinged with the delicate fragrance of lavender and fresh linen, scents chosen to soothe the restless heart. Marianne looked up from her workbench, her eyes meeting mine with a warmth that steadied the storm within. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, her voice a balm to my frayed nerves. I nodded, the weight of years settling into a quiet resolve. "It is time." Together we prepared the garment, no longer a shackle of mourning, but a tapestry of collective healing. Its design was revolutionary, woven threads of soft grays and gentle blues, embroidered with symbols of renewal and remembrance, crafted to honor sorrow without suffocating the soul. It was a garment that invited comfort rather than command, freedom rather than fear. Word had spread swiftly of the public unveiling. Crowds gathered in the square, a motley assembly of faces, some skeptical, others hopeful, many uncertain. The heavy clatter of boots and rustle of old grief garments were slowly giving way to murmurs of curiosity, tentative steps toward acceptance. As I stepped forward, the murmurs hushed, a palpable tension rippling through the gathering. Holding the garment aloft, I felt the weight of countless stories woven into its fabric, the silent tears, the whispered prayers, the quiet courage of those who dared to hope. "This is not merely cloth," I began, my voice steady despite the tremors beneath. "It is a symbol, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. No longer must grief be worn as a prison. It may be felt deeply and truly, but it need not bind us in chains of fabric and fear." The crowd responded not with words, but with a profound silence, a shared recognition of the truth laid bare before them. In that moment, the rigid structures of mourning began to unravel, thread by thread. As the sun climbed higher, children played freely nearby, their laughter clear and unburdened by the weight of sorrow's apparel. Their bright clothes fluttered like flags of a new era, one where grief was a private journey, not a public decree. I watched them, a quiet smile touching my lips. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges yet unseen. But for the first time in many years, I believed in a future where sorrow could be embraced without being worn, a future where the heart alone bore its pain, free and unshackled. And as the city breathed anew beneath the soft light of dawn, I knew my work was not yet done. But the first stitch of change had been sewn, and the tapestry of hope was beginning to unfold. The night may still hold shadows, but the dawn was coming, unclothed in grief, radiant in possibility. And so, with steady hands and a hopeful heart, I stepped forward into the new day.